The cold hit me first, a sudden, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones long before I saw him. It wasn't the kind of crisp, invigorating air you get in autumn. This was a predatory cold, the kind that steals your breath and promises something worse. I was on my knees, knuckles raw, a jagged piece of brick digging into my palm, the metallic tang of blood a bitter counterpoint to the coppery smell of ozone clinging to the air around the man standing over me. His eyes, usually a placid, unsettlingly calm blue, were now chips of glacial ice, reflecting the distorted terror of my own face. A faint, almost imperceptible thrum vibrated through the cracked pavement, a sound I'd only ever heard before moments before the world decided to go sideways. His smile, when it came, was a razor-thin line, devoid of warmth, a chilling rictus that promised an end I didn't want to contemplate. My worn leather jacket, usually a shield, felt like tissue paper against the invisible force pressing me down. My hand, as if on autopilot, went to my old analog wristwatch, the cold metal a small, futile anchor in the maelstrom. It was then I saw them, unfolding from his back with a sound like tearing silk and splintering glass. Vast, intricate structures, feathered with a darkness that seemed to drink the meager streetlights. Pure black, veined with silver, catching the light in a way that defied physics. Beautiful, terrifying, and entirely, irrevocably, real. The whole damn mess, as most of my messes did, started with a flat tire in a dwindling fuel gauge on a road that probably hadn't seen a repair crew since before my parents were born. The rusted Ford coughed its last wheezing breath outside a sign that read, "In faded, peeling paint. Welcome to Smithin. Population declining." I hadn't planned on stopping. I never planned on stopping anywhere for long. My life was a perpetual motion machine, a frantic, joyless dance across state lines, chasing the next anonymous paycheck and the illusory promise of forgetting. The trauma of Sycamore Grove, the fire, the things that had burned with my family. It was a scar I carried, a phantom limb that throbbed whenever I stayed too long in one place. I was a magnet for the unusual, a lightning rod for the horrific, and I knew it, so I kept moving. But Smithin had me. The town itself was a testament to neglect. Buildings sagged, paint peeled in long, leprous strips, and the air hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and something vaguely metallic, like rust or old blood. A diner with a flickering neon sign offered burnt coffee and questionable eggs, and a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration boasted a single, wheezing air pump. I fixed the tire, topped off the tank, and, feeling the familiar pull of my empty wallet, decided to look for a quick night shift. Security guard, warehouse, anything that kept me out of the sun and away from prying eyes. That's how I met Brad. He ran the local general store, a sprawling, dusty place that smelled of mothballs and forgotten dreams. He was too handsome for Smithin, too polished, sharp suit, a smile that could disarm a bomb, and eyes that were a startling, vibrant blue. He had an apartment above the store, he said, and was looking for someone to cover the graveyard shift at the old cannery a few miles out of town. The last guy, he explained with a dismissive wave of his hand, had just moved on. I'd heard that one before. A lot of people moved on in my world, usually without leaving a forwarding address or a body. My internal alarm bells, rusted and half broken as they were, started to clang immediately. This guy was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not like Ethan, the smiling cannibal, or Olivia, the woman who wore human skin. Brad was subtle. It was in the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, in the sudden, almost imperceptible drop in temperature when he walked past, or the way the dust motes in the sunbeams seemed to swirl differently around him. My survivor's gaze, honed by years of being prey, picked up on it. He moved with an effortless grace that bordered on the unnatural, like a cat stretching, but with an underlying coiled tension that suggested immense barely contained power. I took the job, of course. My wallet overruled my instincts, as it always did. And maybe, just maybe, that cursed, reluctant conscience that always seemed to get me into trouble whispered that something was simmering under Smithen's decaying surface, and I might just be in a position to see it. The cannery was a cavernous, echoing mausoleum of rusted machinery and stale fish air. Perfect. Isolated. Just me and the creaking pipes and the occasional scurrying rat. Brad would drop by sometimes, ostensibly to check on things, but his visits always left me on edge. He'd bring me lukewarm coffee in a chipped mug, his smile unwavering, and talk about the town, about the simple life. But then he'd drop a comment, a non sequitur, that would send a shiver down my spine. "People here are so predictable," he'd say, his eyes distant, "like puppets on strings." Or, "You know, the human body is surprisingly resilient, or perhaps surprisingly fragile, depending on your perspective." I remembered a cold evening, not long after I started the job. I was walking back from the diner, the smell of burnt grease still clinging to my jacket, when I heard a commotion a block away, a loud, slurred shout, then a high-pitched scream of pure agony. I ducked into an alley, my heart already hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I'd learned long ago not to rush towards screams. They rarely ended well for the curious. Peeking out, I saw a figure, hunched over, seemingly stuck to the pavement, their legs encased in what looked like a sheath of frost, even though the air wasn't that cold. Brad walked past them, not a flicker of concern on his face, whistling a jaunty tune. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in my direction, as if he knew I was there, watching. My blood ran cold. A familiar sensation. The scream dragged me right back to that snow-choked mountain pass, to the memory of a dead man's impossible whisper, and the understanding that some horrors weren't just anomalies, but deliberate acts. Another time, later, it was a mugging. Not me directly, but I was passing by. 3 figures in the darkened street, one with a knife, a quick struggle, then a sickening wet thud. I saw Brad, a fleeting shadow, standing over the fallen mugger. He leaned in, whispered something, and then, with a flash of light, something glinted in his hand. A knife, but wrong. It was translucent, shimmering, catching the sparse streetlight like a sliver of solidified ice. He plunged it into the mugger's back. The man didn't even scream, just convulsed once and went limp. Brad pulled the knife out, and it dissolved into a puff of vapor, leaving no trace. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the street, settling on my hiding spot for a fraction of a second. A silent acknowledgement, a chilling warning. I pulled back deeper into the shadows, the memory of Olivia and her quiet, methodical cruelty bubbling up. The understanding that some monsters were infinitely more dangerous because they hid behind normal faces in ordinary streets. The wings. I saw them by accident. I was dropping off the weekly cannery report at Brad's apartment above the store. The door was ajar. I hesitated, my hand already reaching for my watch, a nervous tick. My conscience, that self-defeating impulse, decided I should probably knock, but my natural caution kept me from just walking in. I heard a rustle, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, but deeper, stronger, a guttural sigh. Then I saw it, through the narrow gap. Brad, shirtless, his back to me, and erupting from his shoulder blades, impossibly, were the wings. They were huge, easily spanning the width of the room, intricate, almost fractal in their design, shimmering with an inner light that seemed to shift between deep violet and midnight black. They folded and unfolded with a terrible grace, rippling like muscle under skin. Then, as he stretched, they simply reabsorbed, a ripple across his back, and they were gone, leaving only flawless, unblemished skin. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away silently, heart hammering, the chilling knowledge of what I'd seen, a lead weight in my gut. This wasn't some minor parlor trick. This was something ancient, powerful, and utterly alien, like the things that clung to the walls in that apartment building, shifting, observing, waiting. Brad seemed to know I'd seen them. He never brought it up directly, but his demeanor subtly changed. The casual charm still flickered, but underneath it, a new layer of possessiveness, of control, began to emerge. His visits to the cannery became more frequent, his eyes lingering on me a little too long. Then came the cold, not the external chill he projected, but an internal one, a sickness that seemed to seep into his very being. His normally placid demeanor fractured. The subtle wrongness sharpened into overt menace. Sometimes he'd be his usual charming self, offering me coffee, asking about my day. Other times the switch would flip, his face would harden, his eyes would turn glacial, and he'd say things that tightened the knot of dread in my stomach. "You know," he'd intone, his voice like ice-crusted steel, "I could kill you easily, and in such a way that they would never find your body. I'm much more powerful than you give me credit for. Vance, one day, I will show you this. Just hope I'm in a good mood that day and decide to let you live." He never laid a hand on me. Not then. But the implicit threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was worse than a punch. It was a promise of utter annihilation, a casual declaration of ultimate power. My mind flashed back to the NDE, to the farm of cosmic horrors, to the unsettling truth that some beings simply viewed humanity as livestock. And Brad, with his detached cruelty, seemed to embody that same terrifying indifference. Sometimes, I'd wake in my own rented room, a cheap, moldy-smelling box in a boarding house, to find him standing over me in the middle of the night. Just standing there, perfectly still, staring down into my face. His eyes would be glassy, devoid of recognition, like polished stones. I'd lie there, paralyzed, my hand instinctively going for the worn leather of my jacket draped over the chair, a futile comfort. It wasn't love that kept me there. No, my capacity for that had been burned out long ago. It was pure, unadulterated fear, and that damn stubborn conscience. Because people started going missing. First it was just one, an old man who frequented the diner. Then a young woman who worked at the gas station. Then more. The town, perpetually rotting, now began to hum with a low, desperate panic. Posters went up. Police, sleepy and out of their depth, mumbled about drifters and runaways. I knew better. My experiences, my cursed existence, had taught me that when normal explanations failed, the answer was always something worse, something beyond the veil. The dread gnawed at me, a constant, low-frequency hum behind my thoughts. I wanted to run, to pack my go bag, to disappear into the anonymity of the highway. But the faces on the missing posters, the quiet terror in the townspeople's eyes, it pulled at me, like the faint cry of a lost dog. It stirred something that I wish was dead. Brad, meanwhile, seemed to grow stronger, his strange mood swings becoming more pronounced, his presence more unsettling. And the things around the general store, they started appearing. Little things at first, a cheap plastic wristwatch on a dusty shelf that hadn't been there the day before, an old monstrous scratched pair of reading glasses on the counter, nestled between tins of peaches, a child's hair clip on the floor behind the register. They were never explained. Brad never asked me about them. They just appeared. Trophies. It was the only word for it. Each one a tiny, chilling monument to another vanished life. Like Olivia's macabre collection, a grim testament to the predator's success. It solidified the terrifying truth in my mind. Brad wasn't just a weird guy with a bad temper and supernatural powers. He was a monster, a true fairy, in the old, dark sense of the word. And he was hunting. Last night, the phone rang in the boarding house. The landlady, a thin, perpetually worried woman named Agnes knocked on my door, her face ashen. Her younger brother, she said, had gone to the grocery store hours ago and hadn't come back. He was a good man, a veteran. Agnes insisted, never missed a beat. He wouldn't just leave. I nodded, a cold dread already settling in my gut. I knew he wouldn't. He couldn't. This morning, I found it. On the coffee table in Brad's apartment, nestled amongst the usual clutter of receipts and old newspapers, sat a tarnished, slightly bent army badge. Engraved on it, almost too small to read, were the initials RM. Agnes's brother's name was Robert Miller. My blood ran cold, colder than Brad's touch, colder than a winter grave. This wasn't some random disappearance. This was personal now. This was right here, in Brad's lair, staring me in the face. The casual cruelty of it, leaving the badge out in the open, was a statement, a threat, a challenge. My heart hammered, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. My hand went to my watch, a futile gesture. Brad's cold, unsettling voice from the previous night echoed in my ears. One day I will show you this. This was it. This was the moment. The reluctant conscience, my fatal flaw, twisted in my gut. I could run. I had my go bag, the keys to the Ford, enough gas to get me out of Smithin and never look back. But the badge, Robert Miller's badge, seemed to mock me. Another victim, another person I could have, should have, tried to save. My mind screamed at me to flee, but something deeper, something broken and scarred, refused. I looked at the badge, then at the door leading out of Brad's apartment. The metallic tang of ozone, that herald of the truly horrific, was growing stronger. I knew, with a fatal certainty, that Brad was coming, and this time, I wasn't just observing, I was next. My old leather jacket suddenly felt flimsy, threadbare. I had to move. I had to act. And for the first time in a long time, the fear was almost overshadowed by a strange, bitter resolve. Almost. The air was thick with it, the metallic tang of fresh despair coating my tongue, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. Red. So much goddamn red. It painted the motel room walls, the ceiling, the floor, a grotesque Pollock in crimson and rust. My old leather jacket, heavy on my shoulders, suddenly felt like a lead blanket, pressing the nausea down into my stomach. Each breath I took felt heavy, as though the air itself was laden with dread, a chilling, suffocating weight that pressed in from every direction. The silence, when it finally settled after the initial shouts and panicked whispers, was worse. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a hungry, watchful quiet, the kind that swallows screams whole. My hand, as if on autopilot, went to my wrist, my thumb tracing the cold metal of my analog watch. The hands hadn't moved since some point in the early morning hours, stuck, mocking the frantic beat of my own heart. Funny how a simple missing persons call in a forgotten corner of Minnesota could end like this. It all started with an old woman in a closet that wouldn't stay shut. The town of Garrity was nothing more than a forgotten pinprick on a faded map. The kind of place you drove through only if you took a wrong turn off the interstate. I was just passing through, stringing together another string of transient, late-night shifts to keep the wolf from the door and the memories at bay. This time, it was a gig as a contract security guard for a local, laughably understaffed firm, essentially a glorified night watchman for a few businesses and the occasional residential call. It paid cash, and nobody asked too many questions. Perfect. It had been a gloomy, late March morning, the sky a bruised purple that promised more rain, the kind of day where the cold seemed to seep into your bones, settling there like an unwelcome guest. I'd been nursing a lukewarm cup of motel coffee, the kind that tasted like burnt plastic and regret, when Karen, the dispatcher, crackled over the cheap two-way radio they'd given me. Her voice, usually a sugary southern drawl, had an odd, brittle edge to it. Possible 1082 at the Garrity residence, she'd announced, not quite hiding the tremor. It's Eileen again. Eileen Garrity. Even I, a recent transplant to this particular stretch of flyover country, knew about Eileen. She was the local eccentric, the little old lady who cried wolf. Except her wolves were raccoons in the attic, strange lights in her cornfield, or, if the local gossip was to be believed, honest-to-God UFOs. People humored her. They'd send someone out, usually the part-time deputy, to tell her it was just a barn owl or a faulty streetlight. But Karen's tone this morning had been different. It was the same tone I'd heard once or twice before in other towns. A subtle shift from annoyed exasperation to something colder, something like genuine unease. My gut, a loyal but pessimistic companion, had tightened. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't watching, and I was always paranoid. "You want me to roll on that, Karen?" I'd asked, already pulling on my worn leather jacket. It was more a nervous tick than a question. My conscience, that persistent, irritating little voice I'd tried to drown out for years, was already nudging me. Go, check it out, just in case. It was always just in case that dragged me into the deep end. "If you wouldn't mind, Vance," she'd replied, a sigh rustling through the static. "Jerry's tied up with a lost dog, and frankly, I think Eileen just needs someone to listen. You got that way about you." She probably meant, "Looks like he's seen too much and won't judge you for it." She wasn't wrong. So I found myself driving the dented, county-issued sedan, not a patrol car, just a civilian vehicle with a flashing yellow light on the dash, down a narrow, mud-slicked dirt track towards the Garrity farmhouse. The rain had started, a steady drumming against the windshield. Each drop a tiny drumbeat of impending doom. The scent of damp earth and something vaguely metallic, wet leaves and decay, perhaps, or something deeper, older, clung to the air. The farmhouse itself was a study in neglect, a crumbling monument to forgotten fears, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its windows vacant, staring eyes. Mrs. Garrity was on the porch, a hunched silhouette against the gray sky. My foot instinctively hit the brake pedal, the car lurching to a stop in the gravel. Even from a distance, her appearance sent a fresh shiver down my spine. She was gaunt, impossibly thin, her face hollowed out by what looked like weeks, maybe months, of sleepless nights. Her eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, stared out with a terrifying vacancy, yet also a frantic, animalistic fear. Her hands, gnarled and trembling, clutched at the edges of a tattered shawl, as if she were trying to ward off an unseen cold that had nothing to do with the March weather. She swayed slightly, like a reed in a high wind, as if her frail body could no longer bear the weight of whatever she was carrying. It was like the very life had been sucked out of her, leaving behind only an empty, trembling vessel. I'd seen that look before. Usually, it was on the faces of people who'd stared into the kind of abyss that stared back. And usually, I was the abyss. I killed the engine, the sudden silence of the car almost deafening after the rhythmic drumming of the rain. The kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of your own breathing, the frantic thump of your heart against your ribs. I grabbed my mag light from the passenger seat, the heavy barrel of familiar comfort in my hand, and stepped out into the biting chill. The gravel crunched under my boots as I approached the porch steps. "Mrs. Garrity." My voice sounded rough, unused. Her head snapped up, her eyes disturbingly wide, fixed on me. She didn't acknowledge my question, didn't even seem to register my presence as a person. Instead, her voice, a dry, raspy whisper, broke the oppressive quiet. "There's something in my house," she said flatly, utterly devoid of emotion. "Not someone, something." This wasn't a squirrel in the attic. This wasn't a reflection of the moon on her pond. This was the kind of statement that always preceded the kind of trouble I spent my life running from. My conscience, the miserable bastard, suddenly felt a lot less like a conscience and a lot more like a lead weight dragging me deeper into the mud. Inside, the house was worse than the neglected exterior suggested. The air hung thick and heavy, a cloying mix of stale air, dust, damp decay, and an underlying sharp scent that made the hairs on my arms prickle. Copper, almost. Something metallic. Dishes piled in the sink, their surfaces crusted with weeks-old food, green and gray with mold. Pillows and blankets were strewn across the couch like she'd been living there, huddling for days against some unseen terror. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of dust, except for the pathways she must have carved through it. The silence inside was different than outside. It hummed with an unnatural tension, as if the very air vibrated with recent violence. Then I saw them, shattered mirrors. They littered the floor in the living room, their jagged edges glinting in the dim light that filtered through the grimy windows. Each shard seemed to reflect not just the room, but fractured, distorted images of something unseen, twisted, shadowy shapes that hinted at forms both monstrous and unrecognizable. It was as though the shards captured glimpses of another realm, one filled with malevolence and lurking horrors waiting to break through. Or perhaps the mirrors hadn't just broken. They had witnessed something too horrifying to contain, their shattered state a testament to the terror that lingered within the house. I had a sudden, cold thought. Were they broken from the inside? And the closets. Every single closet door had been crudely, violently boarded shut, the nails hammered in with visible, desperate haste, splitting the old wood around the nail heads. It was the kind of work done by someone who wasn't just trying to keep something out, but to keep something in. My hand went to my watch again, my thumb rubbing the cool metal, trying to ground myself in something tangible, something that followed rules. But rules, I knew, were often just suggestions to the things that crawled in the dark. "She's been living like this," I mumbled, more to myself than to Mrs. Garrity, who had slumped into a dusty armchair, clutching a worn rosary. The beads clicked together with a frantic rhythm. "Months," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper. "They started in the bedroom closet." My eyes scanned the room, landing on a dusty corner near the fireplace. Her husband's old hunting shotgun leaned there, abandoned. 2 shells were on the floor beside it, glinting dully in the gloom. I knelt, my boots crunching on mirror shards, and carefully picked one up. It was still warm, the faint smell of gunpowder lingering. Someone had fired this recently, very recently. "What were you shooting at, Mrs. Garrity?" I asked. My voice calm, but my stomach was doing a slow, cold roll. Whatever it was, it had been close enough to shoot at, and it hadn't been a raccoon. She didn't answer directly. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to be staring through me, into something beyond. She began to recount her story, her voice a hollow, reedy whisper, punctuated by the frantic clicking of her rosary beads. It had started weeks ago, soft scratching noises emanating from her bedroom closet. At first, she dismissed it. A mouse. The house was old after all, but the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, a rhythmic scraping like claws on wood. Then came the marks, 6 feet up the interior closet door, long, deep gouges in the old pine, too high for any rodent, too deep for any cat, too deliberate. And then, the voices. They started as whispers, indistinguishable. Then they solidified, taking on a familiar cadence. Her late husband's gentle tone, calling her name, mocking her. "He's been gone 5 years," she whimpered, her voice cracking. "It wasn't him. It couldn't be. It was twisted." The banging started soon after. Violent, jarring blows from inside the closet, shaking the doors on their hinges, rattling the very walls of the farmhouse. She'd prayed. She'd barricaded the door. She'd even fired the shotgun, blasting 2 rounds into the solid wood, hoping to scare it, wound it, make it stop. It hadn't. It had only gotten louder angrier. And then, last night, it had whispered again. Not her husband's voice, a new one. A raw, guttural whisper that had filled the house with an unholy resonance. Tonight, it had promised. Tonight, Eileen. The air in the room felt heavy, the oppressive silence punctuated only by the frantic clicking of Mrs. Garrity's rosary. My skin crawled. The story was absurd, the kind of deranged fantasy a person might conjure after too many lonely nights in an isolated farmhouse. But her fear was terrifyingly real, a tangible thing that permeated the dust-filled air. The details were too vivid, too unsettling to dismiss outright. My cynicism, usually a sturdy shield, felt thin, porous. I found myself remembering flashes of things I tried to forget, things that lurked at the edges of my own fragmented childhood memories. The smell of smoke and something else, something metallic and sweet, like blood and roses. The feeling of being watched, always watched, even when I was alone. "Mrs. Garrity," I said, forcing my voice to be calm, steady. "You need to get out of here, at least for the night." She looked at me then, really looked at me, a flicker of something like hope in her haunted eyes. "But it'll follow me." "We'll find you a safe place," I promised, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. There was no safe place. Not really. Not from things like this. But it was what she needed to hear. "Pack a bag, just a small one." She didn't argue. She just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, before slowly, stiffly, rising from the armchair. Every movement seemed to be a monumental effort. I watched her shuffle towards the hallway, her eyes still darting towards the bedroom, towards the closet with the shotgun blast in its door. It was the only time I'd seen someone move away from a threat with such a profound sense of resignation. She knew it was pointless, but she complied anyway, because it was the only option left. I waited outside while she gathered her things, the rain a steady tattoo on the metal roof. The world felt muted, eerily still, as if holding its breath. The distant croak of crows seemed to carry an unnatural weight, their calls sounding less like birds and more like omens. When she finally emerged, a small, worn valise clutched in her trembling hand, she looked even more frail, more terrified. I drove her to the only motel on the edge of town, a rundown two-story affair that smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarette smoke. It was the kind of place where dreams came to die, not where people sought refuge, but she didn't care. She clung to the key I handed her like a lifeline, her knuckles white. As I turned to leave, she offered a whispered, "Thank you, young man," her voice barely audible. The relief that washed over her face was palpable, profound. It was the face of someone who had just been given a temporary reprieve from a death sentence. It made my stomach clench. I knew, with a certainty born of bitter experience, that some things couldn't be outrun. As I pulled the county sedan away from the motel, the rain had stopped, leaving the night eerily silent. The few streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that danced with the occasional gusts of wind. My hand was on my watch again, checking the time that never seemed to move forward, only cycle back on itself, trapping me in an endless loop of dread. I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, something flickered in the window of Mrs. Garrity's room, a faint, flickering glow, a deep, pulsating red. My brow furrowed, and I glanced back again, gripping the steering wheel tighter. My breath hitched. Was it a reflection? The taillights of my own car? The motel sign? I kept driving, the image lingering, an unpleasant aftertaste in the back of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, but the little hairs on my neck were standing at attention, a familiar warning. I pushed it down. Deny, deny, deny. It was a coping mechanism, a terrible one, but all I had left. The chief's call came at 4 a.m., ripping me from a restless, dream-haunted sleep. The kind of sleep that wasn't really sleep at all. Just a brief respite from the constant vigilance, peppered with flashes of an old house burning and a scream I couldn't quite remember. Get to the motel. Now! His voice was sharp, strained, carrying an urgency that sent a jolt of anxiety through me, a shock of cold dread that went straight to my marrow. He hadn't bothered with pleasantries. He knew I'd understand. And I did. My old boots hit the cold, linoleum floor with a thud. I was dressed and out the door in under 2 minutes. My go bag, always packed, always near the door, already slung over my shoulder. Some people had emergency kits for natural disasters. I had one for unnatural ones. When I arrived, the motel parking lot was a cacophony of flashing blue and red lights, painting the damp asphalt in a macabre disco. Yellow tape, stark against the drab motel exterior, already cordoned off Mrs. Garrity's room. A couple of actual sheriff's deputies stood outside, looking pale and ill. The chief was already there, his face a ghostly white under the flashing lights, his usual stoicism replaced with a flicker of raw, unadulterated fear. That was when I knew. This wasn't a lost dog or a prank call. This was the real deal. The kind of real deal that followed me like a shadow. I ducked under the tape, my stomach churning. Inside, chaos reigned. The air, already thick with the scent of mildew and stale smoke, was now overpowered by the coppery tang of blood. Fresh blood. So much of it, it painted the walls and ceiling in violent streaks, a gruesome, abstract masterpiece. The scent was nauseating, a mix of copper, fear, and decay that seemed to seep into my very skin, clinging to my clothes, my hair. Every breath felt heavy, as though the air itself was laden with an invisible, suffocating dread. The room carried a terrible, suffocating weight, as if the walls themselves were alive, closing in on us with silent menace. It was cold, unnaturally so, the kind of bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. It was a cold that vibrated with malevolence, an ancient, predatory cold that sank into my soul, making it hard to breathe. Deep, angry claw marks gouged the wooden furniture, the dresser, the nightstand, their splintered edges standing out starkly against the dark stains of blood. It looked like a wild animal had gone on a rampage, but there was no wild animal, just a terrified old woman. And then I saw it, the closet door. It stood ajar, casting a shadow that seemed unnaturally long and deep, a yawning maw of darkness. It was as though it led somewhere far more sinister than its modest dimensions should allow. And the room was empty. No body, no signs of a struggle beyond the grotesque scene, no overturned furniture, no broken glass beyond the mirror shards that might have already been there from the farmhouse. Just the blood and the overwhelming sense of malevolence that made every hair on my body stand on end. The door was locked from the inside, one of the deputies whispered, his voice barely audible, thick with disbelief. Chief checked it himself. The chief ran a trembling hand over his scalp, his gaze fixed on the blood-splattered wall, as if trying to decipher a terrible message. "What the hell happened here?" he muttered, more to himself than to us. He looked like an old man suddenly confronted with the existence of devils. He looked like I felt most days. My eyes, trained by years of unwilling observation, scanned the floor. 10 thin streaks, where fingers had clawed in desperation. The marks ended abruptly at the closet door. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum beat against the silence. The air around it felt even colder, heavier, charged with a malevolent energy that pressed down on me. I hesitated before peering inside, my hand on the mag light, though I knew it would be useless. The closet was empty, but the sense of something malevolent lingered, a thick, greasy film on the air. It felt like standing in the mouth of a hungry beast. We never found Mrs. Garrity. Her blood-streaked motel room became the stuff of local legend, a chilling reminder of her mysterious, Impossible fate. The official report labeled it a missing persons case, leaving a neat, clinical explanation for something that defied all reason. But those of us who had been there, who had seen the claw marks and felt that soul-deep, biting cold, knew better. We knew it wasn't just cold, it was the kind of numbing, biting freeze that carried with it a sense of pure dread, a silent scream of ultimate terror. It was the scent of the void, and it clung to everything. Months later, the job long over. Garrity just another blurry, unpleasant memory in the rearview mirror of my nomadic life. I found myself passing through the area again. Stupid, I know, but the road called, and sometimes the road just loops back on itself. A grim curiosity, or perhaps my persistent, regrettable conscience, drew me back to the Garrity farmhouse. It was just as I remembered it, more dilapidated, more forlorn. The boards still covered the closets, a futile attempt to cage the darkness within. Shards of shattered mirrors still glinted on the floor, reflecting distorted images of the empty, dust-filled rooms. The silence was even deeper now, an ancient, knowing silence that filled the space where life had once been. I was in the living room, trying to make sense of the lingering wrongness, when my burner phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. Unknown caller. My breath hitched, a sudden, cold knot forming in my stomach. My pulse quickened, a frantic rabbit against my ribs. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Who could it be, and why now? My fingers hesitated over the accept button, trembling slightly. No one I knew had this number. No one. This was my throwaway line, my escape route. This was impossible. But then, that damn conscience, that fatal flaw, it whispered, "What if?" And I, like a fool, listened, summoning a courage I rarely felt. I finally swiped to answer. The line crackled with static, a familiar sound that always preceded bad news. And then, a voice. A whisper, dry and papery, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. A voice I knew, a voice that had haunted my waking thoughts and my nightmares for months. "It's not done with me, Mrs." Garrity whispered, her voice strangely disembodied, as if coming from a great distance, or perhaps from somewhere just behind me. "And it's coming for you next." The line went dead. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the buzzing silence. The silence of a dead line. The silence of a dead woman. The air in the farmhouse seemed to drop another 20 degrees, the unnatural cold prickling my skin. My eyes darted to the closest boarded closet door, then to the shattered mirrors, their distorted reflections seeming to mock me. Even now, years later, her voice echoes in my mind, a chilling whisper that refuses to fade. I'll never forget the sound of her terror, the resignation in her final words. And every time I hear a faint scratching in the walls of whatever cheap motel room I'm hiding in, or feel an unnatural chill settle over me, I wonder, I always wonder, is it here? Is it finally coming for me too? And what the hell am I going to do about it? My hand went to my watch again, checking the time. It was always time, and it was always running out. Total character count, 9942. The slick, wet sound of tearing flesh wasn't what got me, nor was it the guttural, hungry growl that vibrated through the very floorboards beneath my feet. It was the way Luke's legs, clad in faded denim, kicked frantically, impossibly, for one last, desperate moment before they too vanished into the maw of what had once been Ms. Jacobs. My own body was pinned, an invisible vice crushing me against the wall, forcing my eyes open, scorching the image onto the back of my eyelids where it would forever replay, a silent film of absolute, unvarnished horror. There was no scream left in me, just a thin, reedy whimper caught in a throat that felt like it had been stuffed with sawdust and rusty nails. My mind, already a fragile thing even back then, felt the strain. 1,000 tiny fractures spiderwebbing across its surface, threatening to shatter completely. The air, thick with the stench of something ancient and foul, suddenly cracked with a report like a thunderclap, and for a blessed, fleeting second, the monstrous visage focused on me wavered. That was how it ended, not with a whimper, but with a tearing, wet sound that would echo in my nightmares for decades. But to understand how we got there, how a couple of wide-eyed kids stumbled into a den of primordial evil, you have to go back to a simpler time, a time when the monster still wore human skin, at least for a while, and the world hadn't quite torn itself open at the seams for me yet, back when I was just Ricky. And my biggest problem was what kind of candy to spend my hard-earned detective money on. It's funny, the things you remember. Most of my childhood is a blurry mess, a vast, empty canyon that echoes with forgotten names and faces. There's a specific kind of amnesia that comes from trauma, a brain's desperate attempt to protect itself by sealing off the worst of it. But some things, some moments, cut through that fog like a butcher's knife, leaving deep, ragged scars that never quite heal. The summer I turned 10 was one of those moments. That was the summer Luke and I decided to become the Brook Street Sleuths. Luke was my best friend, all elbows and knees, with an imagination that could conjure entire worlds out of thin air. He was the architect of our grand detective scheme, inspired by the gritty private eye shows we'd sneak watch on his dad's old black and white TV. We lived on Brook Street, a quiet, tree-lined artery in a town so small it practically disappeared if you blinked too hard in the Oregonian mist. Calling ourselves the Brook Street Sleuths felt important, professional. It gave a certain weight to our adventures, a veneer of seriousness over what was, essentially, just two kids looking for an excuse to eat more candy. Our headquarters was Luke's treehouse, a rickety perch overlooking his backyard, where the only thing truly mysterious was how it managed to stay upright after a good gust of wind. We drafted our advertisement on a crumpled piece of notebook paper, our combined handwriting a testament to enthusiasm over penmanship. The Brook Street Sleuths, no mystery too small, inquire at Elmer's Market. We even offered a discount for chipmunk-related cases, which, as it turned out, was surprisingly good for business. Mr. Elmer, a man whose face was a roadmap of kindly wrinkles, let us pin our masterpiece to the community board for free, a gesture of small-town generosity that felt like a major victory to us. Looking back, I wonder if he just found our earnestness amusing, or if he saw the nascent hunger for purpose, however misguided, in our young eyes. Probably both. For a month or so, that summer, we were on top of the world. Our caseload was, admittedly, less hard-boiled detective and more lightly poached suburban curiosity. Who's been taking the blackberries from Miss Jacob's brambles? We solved that one with the kind of diligent surveillance usually reserved for international espionage. Turns out, it was almost everyone who passed by. And, true to our chipmunk discount, a literal army of the little furred bandits. What made the small hole in the Lowry's front yard? Another chipmunk. Of course, the town, as I recall, was practically overflowing with the chittering rodents. They were the bane of gardeners and the unwitting catalyst for our burgeoning detective careers. But not all our cases involved the critters. Some were slightly more complex, like the mystery of the missing garden gnome, which turned up in Old Man Henderson's bird bath, wearing a tiny pair of sunglasses. To the adults who hired us, these weren't really mysteries. They were just excuses to give two bored kids a sense of purpose, a bit of pocket money, and a steady supply of sodas and candy bars. They played along, and God bless them, nodding sagely as we presented our groundbreaking findings, praising our sleuthing skills. It was the best thing about living in a community like that, the willingness of neighbors to foster a child's imagination, even if it meant pretending a missing garden gnome was a high-stakes felony. I remember thinking, back then, that this was how life worked. Little problems, easily solved, with a sweet reward at the end. I had no idea that some mysteries didn't have answers, only consequences. The Brook Street Sleuths, despite our impressive, to us, success rate, was a short-lived agency. Our final case, the one that burned the innocence right out of us, began with a very real, very chilling question. Where is Mr. Page's dog? Frank Page was my next-door neighbor, a retired widower whose house always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books. His companion was Milo, a Yorkie with the energy of a small, yappy tornado. Frank, in his gruff but affectionate way, often referred to Milo as a pain in the proverbial. And it was true. Milo was an expert escape artist, a four-legged Houdini who could squeeze through the smallest gaps in the fence or dart out the front door faster than you could blink. He'd usually spend an hour or two terrorizing the neighborhood squirrels or charming the ladies at the bakery for scraps, then return home with a triumphant tail wag and a muddy nose. It was a familiar pattern, a harmless eccentricity, until it wasn't. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and faded orange, we heard Frank's voice, hoarse with worry, calling Milo's name from his doorstep again and again. Milo, here, boy, Milo. Kunaya, the calls grew more frantic, less like a man scolding a mischievous pet and more like a father searching for a lost child. It had been several hours, Frank told my dad later, and Milo still hadn't returned. My dad, ever the good neighbor, offered to drive around, scanning the streets, shining his headlights into bushes, but came back empty-handed. The quiet desperation in Frank's eyes that night, the slump of his shoulders as he closed his front door, it dug a small, uneasy hole in my chest. Even then, I felt that familiar, unwelcome tug, that sense of responsibility that would later become my constant companion and my fatal flaw. The next morning, the air hung heavy, not just with the usual Oregonian damp, but with an unspoken tension. I went over to Frank's house. His kitchen, usually bustling with the clatter of breakfast dishes, was silent. Milo's food bowl sat untouched by the back door. Frank, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him, was hunched over his kitchen table, a photograph of Milo clutched in his trembling hand. I helped him make a missing poster, the kind you see tacked to bulletin boards in grocery stores, a silent plea for a lost piece of someone's life. I watched as he carefully glued Milo's photo onto a sheet of paper, his large calloused fingers fumbling with the small glue stick. I, with my neat, practiced handwriting, penned the details underneath in black marker, dictated by Frank in a voice that kept catching in his throat. We went to Elmer's Market, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the rows of canned goods. The photocopy machine, usually costing $1 for 10 copies, spat out our duplicates without a single coin. Mr. Elmer, his kind eyes clouded with sympathy, simply waved us off. No charge, boy, hope you find him. He bought me a cola from the cooler, the condensation beating on the can, cold against my palm. You're a good kid, Ricky, Frank said, patting my back, the gesture feeling heavy and paternal. He's a little shit, pardon my French, but I'd be lost without him. The lump in my throat grew, a tight knot of sympathy and a burgeoning sense of purpose. We'll find him, Mr. Page, I said, the words feeling too grand for my 10-year-old mouth, but uttered with all the conviction I could muster. The Brook Street Sleuths are on the case. He managed a weak chuckle, a sound that held no humor, only weary resignation. I'll go knock for Luke just as soon as we put up these posters. We left one on Mr. Elmer's community board, a stark black and white plea amidst brightly colored flyers for bake sales and garage cleanouts. The remaining copies we plastered on telegraph poles and the 2 bus shelters in town, the sticky tape struggling against the damp morning air. Before I knocked for Luke, I made sure to hold on to the original photograph of Milo. It felt important, like a sacred artifact. This way, I could show it to everyone during our investigation, a tangible piece of the missing dog, a symbol of our quest. Back home, my mom was folding laundry, the scent of detergent filling the air. "Don't wander too far, Ricky," she said, her voice a calm counterpoint to the turmoil brewing inside me. "And stay out of the woods. I don't like the thought of you boys in there alone." The woods, a dark, verdant expanse that bordered the back of town, a forbidden kingdom for unsupervised children. Of course, I absolutely planned on looking in there. It was the most logical place a dog might wander, especially an escape artist like Milo. I promised Mom I wouldn't, of course, a lie that felt necessary at the time. I grabbed my bike, the handlebars cool beneath my palms, and pedaled hard to Luke's house, the missing dog poster fluttering in my backpack like a distress signal. Luke was already waiting, his eyes alight with the thrill of a new case, though a somber one this time. We rode our bikes around town, the sun climbing higher, casting long shadows. We knocked on doors, explaining our mission, holding up Milo's picture, watching the faces of strangers morph from polite curiosity to shared concern. It was mostly unsuccessful, a string of "no, haven't seen him," and "I'll keep an eye out." But then, one lady, a kind woman with a flower garden that spilled over onto the sidewalk, had a sliver of information. "Now that I think about it," she mused, a finger pressed to her chin, "I did see a little dog sniffing around the brambles on Maple Road yesterday. Yes, I'm almost certain that's the dog I saw." "Thank you, ma'am," Luke said, his voice crisp and professional. We retrieved our bikes from the end of her driveway, our wheels crunching on the gravel. "There are 2 houses on Maple Road with brambles in the yard," Luke said, already piecing together the clues. "Ms. Jacobs," I supplied, picturing her neatly trimmed bushes. "And the Deans. Why did it have to be the Deans?" The Dean family. The very name sent a tiny shiver down my spine. They were not known for their warm community spirit. Their yard was a junkyard of rusted car parts and forgotten machinery. And then there was Tommy Dean, the oldest son, a high school senior with a reputation as a troublemaker, a hulking presence who'd caused Luke and me plenty of grief in the past. To make matters worse, the Deans had a dog of their own, a brute of a German shepherd named Kane, whose barks echoed through the neighborhood like thunder. The thought of poor Milo, a little Yorkie, crossing paths with Kane felt like a prelude to disaster. "We'll go to Miss Jacobs' house first," Luke decided, ever the optimist. "If we're lucky, we won't have to go to the Deans at all." It was a short ride to Maple Road. We left our bikes on the sidewalk, leaning against a neatly manicured lawn, and walked up Ms. Jacobs' pathway. Her garden was a riot of color, neatly tended, smelling of roses and damp earth. "Well," she said warmly, opening her door, her smile crinkling the corners of her eyes, "if it isn't the Brook Street sleuths? Hello, Ms. Jacobs," we chorused, our voices a bit too loud, a bit too eager. "What can I do for you boys? We're looking for my neighbor, Mr. Page's dog," I explained, holding up Milo's photograph. "He went missing yesterday afternoon." "Oh, no," she said, her smile faltering, replaced by a look of concern. "Poor Frank. I'm familiar with that little scamp. I sometimes see him in the yard by the brambles, but I haven't seen him for a few days." "Thank you anyway. Ms. Jacobs?" Luke said, a note of disappointment in his voice. "Of course," she replied. "I'll keep my eye out. Oh, and help yourselves to blackberries." She gestured towards her sprawling bramble patch, heavy with ripe, glistening berries. As we walked down her pathway, the sweetness of the berries hanging in the air, Luke and I exchanged a look of shared concern. Our brief reprieve was over. We now had to visit the Deans. We took the opportunity to eat a few of the ripened berries, their tart sweetness bursting on our tongues, a small, futile act of defiance before braving the den of the beast. Then, we wheeled our bikes down the street, their tires crunching softly on the asphalt, towards the House of Horrors. The Dean's yard was a stark contrast to Ms. Jacob's idyllic garden, it was overgrown, a tangle of weeds and dying grass. Scraps of metal, rusted hulks of forgotten vehicles, lay strewn about like the bones of some prehistoric beast. It wasn't just unkempt, it felt hostile. The air here was still and heavy, devoid of the chirping birds and buzzing insects that populated the rest of the neighborhood. This was a place where things went to die, or worse. We slowly, hesitantly, walked up the cracked concrete path, our footsteps feeling unnaturally loud. As soon as my knuckles brushed the door, a sudden explosion of loud, furious barking erupted from inside, making us both jump back, a raw, primal sound that vibrated through the wood. Footsteps pounded, then a guttural shout. "Shut the hell up!" The door flew open, revealing Mr. Dean, a burly man with a permanent scowl etched on his face, struggling to hold back Kane, their monstrous German shepherd, by a thick leather collar. The dog was a snarling, teeth-baring fury, straining against his leash, its eyes locked onto us with predatory intensity, a low growl rumbling in its massive chest. "What do you want?" Mr. Dean snarled, his voice as rough as sandpaper. "Hello, sir," I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs, each beat a frantic drum. "We're asking around to see if anyone has seen my neighbor's dog." I held up Milo's picture. The small Yorkie's innocent face, a stark contrast to the snarling beast before us. "He went missing yesterday. And what makes you think I had anything to do with it?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing, suspicion hardening his features. "It's not like that, sir," Luke interjected, his voice surprisingly steady. "We're just asking if you've seen him. That's all. He sometimes wanders around the neighborhood." Mr. Dean let out a short, humorless laugh, a harsh, grating sound. "Who do you think you are? Columbo or some shit?" Luke and I exchanged a look, a silent communication that conveyed our immediate regret. This was a bad idea, a very bad idea. The air thrummed with a dangerous energy, a coiled aggression that made my skin crawl. "We're sorry to have bothered you, sir," I said, already turning to leave, my legs feeling heavy, like I was moving through thick mud. "Believe me," he scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. "If that rat had been anywhere near here, Kane would have sorted it out." The German shepherd let out another low, rumbling growl, a promise of violence. We hurried back down the path, the sound of the dog's renewed barking chasing us, a chilling echo in the otherwise quiet afternoon. We jumped on our bikes, our movements clumsy with haste, and pedaled like demons were hot on our heels, my heart beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. We didn't stop until we rounded the corner, out of sight of the Dean's house, gasping for breath. The uncomfortable laughter that bubbled out of us then was born of pure adrenaline and raw relief. "God, I hate that family," Luke wheezed, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Just then, the roar of an engine split the quiet, and a rust bucket of a car, its paint peeling like old skin, came hurtling around the corner, its tires screeching on the asphalt. It was Tommy Dean behind the wheel, his face a smirk of casual cruelty. When he noticed Luke and me, he lifted a hand, not in greeting, but to give us the finger, his eyes glinting with malicious amusement, before he sped away, vanishing down the road in a cloud of exhaust. "So suspicious," I said, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "But maybe too obvious?" Luke shrugged, his shoulders still heaving from the exertion. "They're assholes. Yeah, but I think we need to investigate more first. Rule number 1, follow the evidence, not the feeling." Wise words from a 10-year-old. I suppose it was true, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. The Deans were the kind of people who felt wrong, even when you couldn't put your finger on why. It was an instinct that would, in later years, save my life more times than I could count. When it felt like we'd exhausted all avenues in town, our energy flagging, our hopes dwindling, I suggested the woods. The idea hung in the air, heavy and forbidden. Luke was apprehensive, his usual bravado tempered by the strict warnings from our parents. The woods were off limits, a wild, untamed place where shadows stretched long and anything could hide. But it seemed logical, didn't it? A dog, especially one who loved to chase chipmunks, would surely be drawn to the untamed expanse of trees and undergrowth. If we do find Milo there, I reasoned, we'll just pretend we found him someplace that won't get us in trouble. The lie felt hollow even as I said it, but the thought of Milo, lost and alone, twisted in my gut. My reluctant conscience, even then, was a stubborn thing, pulling me into danger despite every instinct to flee. The woods, when we entered them, were darker than I expected, even with the afternoon sun dappling through the canopy. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly cloying. The trees were ancient, their branches tangled overhead, blocking out the sky like a thick, green blanket. We stumbled over exposed roots, pushed through prickly bushes, our voices echoing strangely as we shouted Milo's name from time to time. "Milo! Here, boy! Milo!" Our cries seemed to be swallowed by the silent immensity of the forest, absorbed into the whispering leaves and the rustling undergrowth. We searched for an hour or so, the hope slowly draining out of us with each passing minute. It got to the point where we figured if Milo was somewhere he could hear us, he would have made himself known by now. He was a yapper, after all. Before we gave up entirely, the urgency of nature called. Both of us suddenly, desperately needed a bathroom. "I'll go this way," Luke said, pointing towards a particularly dense thicket. "You go that way." We separated, plunging deeper into the quiet, unsettling embrace of the woods, seeking secluded spots. The silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of unseen birds, felt heavier now, more watchful. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine, a nascent awareness that something was not quite right, though I couldn't articulate why. My analog wristwatch, a hand-me-down from my grandfather, felt heavy on my wrist, a comforting, familiar weight. I found myself tracing the rim of its face, a nervous tic I didn't even know I was developing. Then, a scream. Luke's voice, sharp and high-pitched, cutting through the stillness like a jagged piece of glass. "Ricky!" My heart leaped into my throat. I quickly finished, fumbling with my bike, my hands clumsy with sudden terror. "Where are you?" I yelled, my voice cracking, my nerves stretched taut. "Over here!" His voice was strained, breathless. I scrambled through the undergrowth, pushing aside branches, the adrenaline a sudden, bitter taste in my mouth. I burst into a small clearing, my breath ragged, and saw him. Luke was standing there, frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with an unspeakable horror. He didn't need to answer my frantic question. The clearing was a sick mockery of nature's tranquility. In the center, a crude slab of stone, dark and ancient, lay embedded in the earth. On its surface, drawn in a stark, unsettling white chalk, were 3 triangles, all pointing the same way but overlapping each other, forming a single, disturbing symbol. And in the very heart of that symbol, a single, severed animal paw. Its fur, a familiar auburn, was matted with dried, dark crust. It was Milo's. The sight hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. Around the stone, on the rough bark of several tree trunks, crude, unsettling symbols were drawn. Not chalk this time. No, the dark, rusty hue, the faint, metallic tang that now filled the air. The way it seemed to shimmer faintly in the dappled light, it was blood. Fresh blood. "Oh my God," I whispered, the words barely audible, lost in the sudden, overwhelming dread that choked me. My stomach lurched, threatening to betray me. "I really want to leave now," Luke said, his voice a strangled whisper, fear making him sound years younger. I nodded. my head swimming. "Yeah, come on!" The words were a desperate plea, a desperate need to escape this defilement. The horror had a name now, and it was much more terrible than a simple lost dog. As I turned to grab my bike, my eyes, now hyper-vigilant, caught on something small, half hidden by a moss-covered log, a satchel, a dark canvas bag, looking incongruous in the ancient woods. I walked towards it, a strange, morbid curiosity overriding my terror. Luke spotted it too. "Leave it, Ricky," he hissed, his voice tight with fear. "Don't touch it." "It's evidence," I retorted, the detective instinct, however childish, kicking in. My hand reached out, then hesitated. Instinct, that cold, hard little voice that would one day keep me alive, told me not to contaminate the scene. My fingers trembled as I found a fallen stick, its rough bark against my skin, and used it to lift the flap of the satchel. I peeked inside, a pack of cigarettes and some school textbooks, senior biology and math, not elementary school, not middle school. "Senior? Student," I murmured, the word feeling oddly out of place. My mind, racing, connected the dots. Senior. Tommy Dean. My hands still shaking. I found a large, broad leaf, its surface smooth and cool, and used it to cover my fingertips. Carefully, ever so carefully. I opened the first page of the biology book, written in pencil, in the top right corner, in a messy, aggressive hand. Tommy Dean. A shiver, cold and bone deep, went through me. Not just the chill of the woods, but the icy hand of dawning realization. Tommy Dean, the brute from the Dean house, the one whose dog would sort out Milo, the one who had just given us the finger from his rust bucket car. It was too perfect, too sickening. I told Luke, my voice barely a thread, and his eyes widened to match mine, reflecting the same dawning horror. We didn't need another word. We didn't need to discuss it. We got on our bikes and rode like the wind, the scent of blood and fear, a phantom presence in our nostrils, heading straight for the sheriff's office. We burst through the double doors, the bell above jingling frantically, announcing our frantic arrival. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. "Whoa, fellas," Deputy Campbell said, looking up from behind his desk, his uniform crisp, his face a picture of calm, weary authority. He looked like the kind of man who dealt with lost cats and speeding tickets, not ritualistic animal sacrifice. "Calm yourself now. What seems to be the problem?" We tried to explain, both of us talking at once, tripping over our words, the story tumbling out in a confused cascade of fear and accusations. Milo, the woods, blood, paw, Tommy Dean, symbols. Deputy Campbell, to his credit, didn't laugh. He listened, his brow furrowed, his expression slowly morphing from mild amusement to serious concern. And then, a flicker of something else, disbelief. But then, seeing the raw terror in our eyes, the trembling of our hands, the desperate earnestness of our voices, he made a decision. He escorted us back to the woods, his face grim, his hand resting on the holster of his service pistol. When he saw the clearing, saw the stone slab, the chalk symbols, the severed paw, the blood on the trees, he blanched. "Sweet Mother of Jesus," he muttered, the expletive a hushed prayer. He pulled out his radio, his voice crackling with urgency, calling it in. The woods, so silent moments before, were soon swarming with uniformed officers. Dogs, canine units, sniffed at the ground, their handlers' voices low and serious. Detectives, their faces hard and unreadable, took photographs, collected samples, marked evidence. It was a scene from one of our detective shows, but this time it was terrifyingly real. There was a search conducted at the Dean's house. I heard about it through the walls that night, after my parents had banished me to my room, too shaken and disturbed by what I'd seen to be allowed near the TV. My dad's voice, low and grave, carried through the thin plaster. They found it all, honey, in Tommy's bedroom, an ancient book of the occult, full of those same symbols. And Milo's collar? The last words were almost a whisper, heavy with grim finality. Apparently, Tommy protested his innocence as they took him in for questioning, but the evidence was overwhelming. My stomach churned, a knot of nausea twisting inside me. Poor Mr. Page was devastated. The disturbing yet gruesome nature of it all rocked our sleepy community, tearing a gaping hole in its idyllic facade. People talked in hushed tones, their eyes wide with fear and disgust. Luke and I, however, were commended for our help in the investigation. We received honorary badges from the sheriff's department, shiny, fake gold stars that felt heavy and real in our hands. They were supposed to make us feel like real investigators, heroes even. And for a couple of days, they did. For a couple of days, the horror was overshadowed by the pride, the naive, childish pride of a job well done. I didn't know then that heroism had a steep price, one paid not in candy bars and sodas, but in the currency of sanity and peace of mind. After a couple of days, Ms. Jacobs required our services again. My mom was reluctant for me to carry on playing detective, as she called it, her voice strained, her eyes still holding a shadow of the fear that had gripped the town. But my dad, perhaps seeing the need for some semblance of normalcy, talked her around. Let him go, honey. It'll be good for him. Get his mind off things. He didn't understand that some things, once seen, can never be truly gotten off. Luke and I went to visit Ms. Jacobs late that afternoon, the memory of the past few days still a raw wound beneath the surface. As we approached her house, a wonderful smell wafted from it, warm and inviting. Blackberries. Take a seat, boy, she said, her smile as warm and comforting as the blackberry pie that sat cooling on her kitchen counter. I baked you a blackberry pie. Call it a thank you for your services to the community. Thanks, Miss Jacobs, we both said, a childish eagerness overcoming the lingering unease. We scrambled onto the dining chairs, the polished wood cool beneath our palms. The pie, still warm, sat in the center of the table, its deep purple filling bubbling enticingly, the lattice crust perfectly golden. She cut 2 generous slices, the knife sinking easily through the flaky pastry, and plated them up, handing us one each. Bon appetit, she smiled, taking a seat opposite us as we started tucking into the delicious pie, its sweetness a welcome distraction. Well done on your investigation. That must have been quite a shock discovering such a gruesome scene. Luke nodded, his mouth full. It was scary, wasn't it? Ricky? Yeah, I agreed, chewing slowly, the tartness of the blackberries a pleasant counterpoint to the buttery crust. But we handled it like professionals. She chuckled, a soft, pleasant sound. I'm sure you did. I always knew that Tommy Dean was a rotten apple. I can't help but wonder what it was all for, though. Why sacrifice that little dog? Luke and I looked at each other, shrugging with mouthfuls of pie, unable to offer an answer. The adults, we'd learned, often had questions we couldn't comprehend. And those symbols, she continued, her voice dropping, a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. What did they mean? My dad said it was devil worship, Luke volunteered, always eager to share the latest adult gossip. I'm sure he's right, she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. To think I'd only seen that poor dog a few hours before Tommy took him. I can't help but think I could have done something to help. She reached across the table and patted my hand, her touch surprisingly cold, though I dismissed it as my imagination. Thank goodness you heroes found those school books of his at the scene. Imagine what else he could have done if it weren't for you. I dread to think. Luke and I exchanged another glance, this one filled with a surge of renewed pride. We were heroes. We'd helped. We'd saved the day. The bitter taste of fear and horror began to recede, replaced by the sweet aftertaste of heroism. "Excuse me a moment," she said, rising from her seat. "I'll be right back." The moment she left the room, the hushed, giddy exclamations burst forth. "We're heroes," I chuckled, unable to contain the surge of triumph. "We found the villain and saved the day," Luke giggled, a smear of blackberry pie on his cheek. We kept tucking into the pie, the sweetness dissolving on our tongues, the taste of victory. But as I chewed, slowly, deliberately, a small, insidious worm of unease began to burrow into my mind. Something wasn't quite right. A tiny, dissonant note in the symphony of our triumph. My observational skills, honed by years of trying to decipher cryptic adult conversations and subtle shifts in facial expressions, began to work overtime. Then it hit me, a sudden, cold jolt that made the pie in my mouth feel like ash. My eyes widened, my heart suddenly racing again. "Wait," I said, the word barely a whisper. "Didn't Ms. Jacob say she hadn't seen Milo for days when we were investigating?" Luke shrugged, oblivious, still savoring his pie. "Yeah, so? But she just said she saw him a few hours before. Tommy took him," his brow furrowed, a slow dawning of confusion spreading across his face. "Oh, yeah, she is an old lady, though. Ricky, my grandma is very forgetful." I contemplated it. An old lady, forgetting things. It was a plausible explanation, one that would make the world make sense again. But it still didn't feel right. It was a slight discrepancy, a tiny crack in the story. But it was enough to let the cold dread seep in. My eyes widened further, fixed on Luke, who was still idly chewing. My hand, without conscious thought, went to my wristwatch, tracing the cold metal of the casing, a nascent nervous tick. "The sheriff's department didn't release the evidence," I said, the words barely a whisper, a thread of ice in my throat. "They said it was part of an ongoing investigation. How does she know about the books?" Luke's eyes, bright with the fading afterglow of pride, widened to match mine. The color drained from his face as the implication slammed into him. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. Then, Miss Jacobs came back into the room. She was smiling, a warm, pleasant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Those eyes, I noticed now, were too bright, too keen, holding an ancient, unsettling knowing. "Will you look at that?" she said, her voice lilting, a predatory purr. "You've almost finished your pie. Let me cut you another slice." She moved towards us, a slow, deliberate grace to her steps. "No," I blurted out, the words sharp, desperate. I cleared my throat, trying to regain some composure, some semblance of the polite child I was supposed to be. "It was delicious, Mrs. Jacobs, but very filling." "Very well," she smiled, her eyes lingering on us, a hungry gleam in their depths. "Let me take this dish away then." She reached for the pie dish, her fingers long and slender, but somehow wrong. As she lifted the ceramic dish from the table, Luke and I both stared, our blood running cold, our breaths catching in our throats. Scratched deeply into the polished wooden surface of the dining table were 3 triangles, overlapping each other, identical to the symbol we'd seen drawn in blood in the woods, the same symbol that had been drawn in chalk on the sacrificial stone. "Oh yes," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet amusement. "There was a mystery for you to solve. Boys, a mystery ingredient. I wonder if you've got the detective skills to work it out." Her smile widened, showing teeth that seemed a little too long, a little too sharp. Luke looked at me, his eyes brimming with tears, his lower lip trembling. I felt exactly the same. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. He coughed a little, a strangled, choking sound, and put his fingers to his mouth, pulling something out, a small, dark strand. "What is it, Luke?" she asked, her voice a low, cooing sound, her head cocked to the side, a predator observing its prey. He covered his mouth, a desperate gagging sound escaping him. "Hair! Clue number 1, as she said, her smile never faltering. And you, Ricky?" I shook my head, my voice gone, replaced by a cold nod of terror. "We'd like to leave now, Miss Jacobs." "Nonsense," she said, her voice hardening, losing its pleasant veneer. She plucked my plate away, her fingers brushing mine, sending a jolt of icy fear through me. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she placed the now empty pie dish directly in front of me. "Go on," she purred. "Have a look." I looked at Luke, who was clearly terrified, his eyes wide and pleading. My hands trembled, my very bones feeling brittle, but something, that stubborn, self-destructive streak of responsibility, the need to know, forced my hand. I picked up the fork. My fingers brushed the cool metal, the familiar weight a small comfort in the rising tide of horror. Slowly, deliberately, my vision blurring, I began to pull pieces of the remaining pastry away, digging through the thick, dark purple filling. It was like sifting through something viscous and unnatural. Then, my fork made a distinct, sickening clink sound against something hard. I froze. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop, to run, to forget. But I couldn't. I couldn't look away. I couldn't let it go. My fingers, numb and clumsy, reached into the viscous, dark purple goo. I could instantly feel what it was. Not a berry, not a piece of fruit. It was long, curved, and hard. A tooth, a long, canine tooth. I threw it across the table with a guttural cry. The sound ripped from my very soul, pushing myself back from the table with such force that my chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. I grabbed Luke's arm, my fingers digging into his flesh. "Run!" I yelled, my voice hoarse, raw with terror. "Now!" We scrambled, a tangle of limbs and panic, making a desperate dash for the door. But before we could reach it, before our frantic hands could even touch the doorknob, it slammed shut with a resounding thud that echoed through the room like a death knell. The light that had been filtering through the windows, already dimming with the approaching twilight, now seemed to drain away entirely, plunging the room into an unnatural gloom. The symbol on the table, the 3 overlapping triangles, began to glow. A faint, malevolent red, as if it were drawn in embers, pulsating with an unseen, ancient power. Luke and I, paralyzed by the sheer terror, could only stand there, arms wrapped around each other, sniveling, unable to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before us. Our childish understanding of the world, of good and evil, of what was real and what was fantasy, snapped like dry twigs. Ms. Jacobs smiled from across the room. It was no longer the warm, kindly smile of the neighborhood baker. It was a predator's grin, wide and impossibly sharp. Her hair, suddenly unbound, flowed around her as if caught in a breeze that only she could feel, dark tendrils swirling like smoke. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent that was no longer just the metallic tang of blood, but something cloying and ancient, like earth and decay. "What are your findings, boys?" she purred, her voice deepening, losing its pleasant, human timbre. "The Brook Street sleuths must be able to figure it out." "You killed Milo," I screamed, the words tearing from my throat, raw and desperate. And the thought of it, the horrifying, gut-wrenching implication of what we had found in the pie, made me gag. "Bravo!" she clapped, a slow, deliberate sound, her hands no longer soft, twisting into something gnarled and claw-like. "Make the sacrifice, feed the innocent." Her words were an ancient chant, a chilling revelation. "But why?" Luke screamed, his voice high-pitched and broken, tears streaming down his face. "I am 732 years old," she cackled, the sound a dry, rattling hiss that scraped against my ears, a sound of unimaginable age and depravity. "That takes a bit of black magic to maintain." With a speed that defied her apparent age, a movement too swift for human eyes to follow, she lunged. She grabbed Luke, her clawed hand wrapping around his arm, impossibly strong. I tried to pull him away, my own hand scrabbling uselessly at her arm, but with a flick of her wrist, a gesture of casual, horrifying power, I was flung backwards, slamming against the wall, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. She threw Luke down onto the glowing symbol on the table, a sickening thud. He screamed out, a raw, piercing sound of agony as wisps of dark, acrid smoke began to rise around him, curling up from the symbol like an offering. "It burns," he screamed, his voice choked with pain, his body writhing. "Leave him alone," I cried, my voice hoarse, tears streaming down my face, my body aching with a desperate, futile need to help him. She turned to me then, her head tilting to the side, a slow, deliberate movement. The features that had made her Jacobs, the familiar, kindly face of our neighbor, faded, melted away like wax, revealing something ancient and utterly decayed beneath. Loose, leathery skin hung from visible bones, stretched taut over a skull that seemed too large, too alien. Her eye sockets were empty, dark, gaping holes, no hint of humanity left within them. Wispy strands of brittle, gray hair, like dried moss, clung to her scalp. Her teeth, impossibly long and pointed, were surrounded by split, leathery gums, a grotesque parody of a smile. The air grew colder, heavy with the stench of the grave, of things that should have remained buried. "You next, Ricky!" she yelled, her voice no longer Ms. Jacobs' gentle cadence, but a deep, guttural roar, demonic and ancient, a sound that vibrated in my very bones. Her mouth opened wide, wider than any human mouth should. It stretched, distended, the jaw unhinging, revealing a black, cavernous void lined with rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth that seemed to shift and writhe. And then, she took Luke's whole head inside. The sight was so utterly, viscerally wrong, so profoundly against the laws of nature, that my mind simply shut down. His arms and legs began to kick about, a horrifying, desperate dance of flailing limbs, as I could hear his muffled groans coming from inside her, wet, sickening sounds of struggle and ultimate defeat. There were snapping sounds, wet and loud, as parts of her dislocated, her body twisting and contorting like a snake swallowing its prey, making room for him, forcing him down. Before long, his shoulders could no longer be seen, swallowed by the grotesque, pulsating mass that had once been a human being. She made greedy, guttural noises, a satisfied gurgle, as she forced his body down her throat, chewing, grinding, swallowing. I was paralyzed against the wall, utterly helpless, forced to watch as my best friend, my partner in childhood adventures, was eaten alive. I could feel my mind snapping, a cacophony of small, sharp cracks, like her ancient bones. Luke's legs were still kicking, a last, desperate, pathetic struggle. Even as she reached his knees, her long, bony fingers tipped with black, talon-like nails, gripped around his ankles, pushing the last bit of him inside, into the wet, consuming darkness. Then, a loud bang, an explosion of noise that startled her as much as it startled me, ripping me from the nightmare. The dining room door, previously sealed by some unseen force, flew open, splintering against the frame. 3 officers burst into the room, led by Deputy Campbell, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "Sweet folking mother of Jesus," he yelled, the expletive a desperate cry, his voice cracking as he took aim at what was once Jacobs. She retched, a terrible, wet, gagging sound. And then, Luke's whole body slipped out of her mouth, covered in a glistening, translucent goo, collapsing onto the table with a sickening splat. He was still, unmoving, a cocoon of horror. I fell from the wall, hitting the floor with a sickening thud, my body a puppet with severed strings. The officers opened fire on her, the deafening cracks of their pistols echoing in the small room, muzzle flashes momentarily illuminating the horror. She recoiled, forced back by the barrage, letting out a multi-layered scream that was part human shriek, part ancient, monstrous bellow. The window shattered, glass exploding inwards, and natural light, the blessed, glorious light of the sun, poured into the room, making her scream even louder, as if she were burnt by its cleansing rays, driven by a primal surge of something beyond fear, something desperate and unthinking. I scrambled forward. I ran to Luke, pulling him from the table, my hands slipping on the viscous coating. He was still, utterly still, but then, a faint, shallow gasp, a single ragged breath, relief, sharp and painful, flooded me. He was breathing. He was alive. The glowing symbol on the table was fading, its malevolent light flickering, dying, and with a final piercing shriek that seemed to tear the very air, the thing that had been Ms. Jacobs became a swirling cloud of dark smoke. It wasn't just dissipating, it was seemingly sucked inwards, drawn into the fading symbol, consumed by the very ritual it performed. Then, everything went deathly silent for a few seconds, the echoes of gunfire and screams slowly fading, replaced by the ringing in my ears. As it happened, Tommy Dean, even in his callous self-interest, had played a part. When he was taken in, he insisted on his innocence, claiming he'd seen Miss Jacobs on his property and that his satchel had gone missing afterwards. He must have been trying to deflect, to shift the blame. But Deputy Campbell, a good man despite the bizarre nature of the claim, pursued it. He managed to convince the sheriff to investigate Ms. Jacobs, even if just to humor a juvenile delinquent. Thank God he did. Thank God for that one small flicker of unlikely justice, because Luke and I would not be here today if it wasn't for him. We carry the mental scars, deep and indelible, but we live. Suffice to say, the Brook Street sleuths were no more after that day. That day, the world became a much larger, much darker place. That day, the whispers in the shadows gained form, and I, Leo Vance, learned that some mysteries don't end with a solution, but with a beginning, the beginning of a long, weary journey, forever on the run from the things that found me in the quiet streets of a small town and have been following me ever since. Character count 9987. The blue and white cruiser sat like a discarded toy, its engine a silent lie, the faint shimmer of condensation on its windows betraying the frigid pre-dawn air. My breath hitched, a rusty nail in my throat, each inhale a jagged tear at my windpipe. On the hood, folded neatly, lay 2 police uniforms, empty and limp as a broken promise, the cold night teasing their fabric. They were gone, all of them, and the message, scrawled in what felt like my own blood on the steamy bathroom mirror, screamed its truth, echoing the universe's cruel joke. We are everywhere. We are everyone. No safe haven. The world, it seemed, wasn't just indifferent. It was a goddamn farm, and I was just another pig for the slaughter, just like that place beyond the veil. No escape. Never any escape. It had started as it always did, with a quiet wrongness, a subtle shift in the familiar fabric of reality that only I, it seemed, was cursed to perceive. Just an hour earlier, I'd woken on my mother's couch, the worn leather of my jacket digging into my side, an unwelcome guest in a nightmare that was only just beginning to unfold its gruesome petals. My mother, bless her oblivious heart, was off on some cruise, probably sipping overpriced cocktails and complaining about the shuffleboard. I'd been house-sitting for her all week, a temporary anchor in a life lived perpetually adrift. The job was easy enough. Feed the cat, water the plants, pretend I was a normal person for a few days. Up until tonight, it had been the most peaceful stretch I'd had in months. A bland, unthreatening monotony I usually craved. Around 10 p.m. or so, my internal clock tried to tell me, a sound ripped through the quiet suburban night, jarring me from a fitful doze. It was static, not the gentle hiss of a faraway radio, but the raw, unadulterated shriek of white noise, escalating from a whisper to a deafening roar in a matter of seconds. My eyes snapped open, my heart already hammering against my ribs, a familiar terror coiling in my gut. I practically vaulted off the couch, my muscles tensing for a fight, a desperate flight, anything but this sonic assault. My gaze darted to the flat-screen TV across the room, its black mirror now a kaleidoscope of frantic, aggressive snow. I lunged, my fingers fumbling for the power button, desperate to silence the caterwauling banshee trapped within the speakers. The instant the screen flickered to black and the horrific noise evaporated, leaving behind a ringing void, my mind finally tried to catch up, like a broken old engine sputtering to life. Confusion, thick and unwelcome, immediately settled over me. I looked at the very couch I'd just abandoned. I didn't remember falling asleep there. In fact, I could have sworn, with the kind of certainty that usually precedes a profound wrongness, that I had been in her spare bedroom, tucked into the too-soft mattress, attempting to coax some actual sleep from my exhausted brain. My hand instinctively went to my wrist, my thumb tracing the cool metal of my old analog watch, a grounding tick I'd developed somewhere between the snow-choked mountain pass and the endless highways. I wasn't checking the time. I was checking for some sliver of normalcy, some proof that the world hadn't quite abandoned its orbit, to shake off the lingering disorientation, or perhaps to simply avoid the creeping dread. I forced myself to examine the living room. It was a comfortable, if dated, space with two beige couches, one nestled against the far wall, facing the TV, and the other, my current perch, tucked under the wide bay window. My gaze swept over the familiar clutter, stacks of magazines, a half-finished crossword puzzle, a forgotten coffee cup. Then I saw it, on the window couch, where I had supposedly been sleeping, a crisp, white piece of paper, folded neatly in half. My brow furrowed. Nobody was supposed to be here, not even close. I walked over, my movements stiff, and picked it up. My fingers, calloused from years of gripping steering wheels and warehouse pallets, unfolded it to reveal cramped, almost childish handwriting. Chicken scratch indeed. Spot the differences? My lips curled into a mirthless smile. A prank. It had to be. I'd completely forgotten I'd given a spare key to Sarah a few weeks back. She was always trying to inject some much-needed fun into my perpetually grim existence. "All right, Sarah," I muttered, my voice a rough rasp in the sudden silence. "I'll play." I put the note down on the glass coffee table, trying to project an air of playful exasperation I didn't feel, and scoped out the entire room. The first thing that snagged my attention was my old, clunky desktop computer. It should have been on the small end table beside the wall-facing couch, a dusty monument to procrastination. Instead, it was on the floor, tucked against the baseboard, almost as if someone had just casually kicked it there. Odd, but not terrifying. Sarah was clumsy. The next thing I noticed made the air in the room feel suddenly heavy, thick with unspoken wrongness. My late grandmother's porcelain doll, that goddamn thing, it usually sat on a high, dusty shelf on the wall, a creepy sentinel collecting dust. Now, it was perched directly where my computer had been, its small, painted smile stretched unnaturally wide. I stared into its black, bead-like eyes, cold and vacant, which clashed sickeningly with its garish jester outfit. A prickle of unease, sharp and sudden, snaked down my spine. This wasn't just a creepy doll. This was a deliberate act, a violation, My gut, a loyal but weary oracle, screamed that something was profoundly, irrevocably wrong. It was the same icy dread that had settled in my bones in that quaint diner with Ethan. The feeling that beauty and normalcy were just a thin veneer over something unspeakable. Or when Olivia had smiled at me with those two bright eyes. This was the whisper of something deeply, domestically wrong. A familiar prelude to the chaos that always seemed to find me. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but my heart, thrumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs, already knew better. There was no rational explanation for the things that clung to my wake. No simple answers for the horrors that insisted on being part of my narrative. I tried to shake it off, to attribute it to Sarah's twisted sense of humor, but the skin on my arms crawled. My hand brushed against the pocket of my cargo shorts, an automatic gesture. When I sleep, I always keep my phone in my pocket, a lifeline, a window to the outside world, however tenuous. It wasn't there. I patted down my pockets again, then scoured the couch cushions, peered under the coffee table. Nothing. The phone was gone. "Okay, joke's over, babe," I yelled out, my voice sounding strained, a little too loud in the sudden, unnerving silence. My cynicism battled with a growing knot of genuine alarm. This wasn't Sarah. This was something else. I expected a playful giggle, a gotcha from a hidden corner. I expected anything but the response I got. After a few seconds of strained silence, a new sound erupted, not from the living room, but from my mother's bedroom. Down the short hall, her ancient, crackling radio, which she only ever listened to for the morning news, suddenly blared to life. Big band music, loud and distorted, a cacophony of brass and drums that sounded less gleeful and more malevolent. The static, I realized with a jolt, had been a prelude. My immediate reaction, one I've never quite understood, was pure, unadulterated fury. Anytime I'm faced with an unexpected, jarringly loud noise, something in me snaps. It's a deep, primal anger that overrides fear. A trauma response I've never been able to trace back to its source, though a part of me always wonders if it's tied to that fire, that chaos from a lifetime ago. I sprinted down the hall, my worn leather jacket slapping against my back, my boots thudding on the thin carpet. I burst into my mother's room, a small, feminine sanctuary now polluted by the sonic assault. My hand reached for the volume knob on the old radio, my jaw tight with a primal need to silence it. I started yelling, for no real reason other than the pure, unadulterated rage that pulsed through my veins. What the hell is going on? "Cut it out!" Just as my fingers brushed the knob, a female singer's voice cut through the brassy din, clear and chilling despite the blare. Her words, sung with a lilting, almost playful cadence, twisted my stomach into knots. Buried alive, my screams I recall. Years went by. People came and they I slammed the volume knob, twisting it counterclockwise with a savage force that nearly ripped it off. The music, the voice, the dread, all died instantly. But my body moved on instinct. My mind screamed at me, a panicked internal voice clawing at my sanity. Turn it back on. Hear what the hell she was saying. The urge was overwhelming, a sickening fascination with the horror, a cursed curiosity. With a shaking hand, I twisted the knob just enough for the softest whisper of sound. It wasn't the woman's crooning, or the big band. It was a popular, catchy pop song, generic and saccharine, playing at a barely audible hum, the kind of song you heard everywhere and never noticed. The transition was so abrupt, so seamless. It was almost more terrifying than the eerie lyrics. It spoke of a deliberate control, a playful cruelty. At this point, the whole spot the differences game had entirely slipped my mind, buried under layers of adrenaline and mounting dread. But when I turned around, it came back in a big, gut-wrenching way. My mother had 3 large, framed family portraits hanging above her bed, a triptych of smiling faces, all from happier, simpler times. But now, to my horror, my own face was conspicuously absent from each one. My head had been meticulously cut out of every photograph, leaving behind gaping oval voids where my smiling face should have been. The sheer, audacious threat of it, the chilling implication, didn't scare me the most. What truly sent a jolt of icy terror through my veins was the impossible precision, the surgical patience, the time someone had taken. They had carefully removed each picture from its frame, severed my head with what looked like an X-Acto knife, then painstakingly replaced the now mutilated photo back into the frame, re-securing it and rehanging it, perfectly straight. I had gotten into my bed, in the spare room, at 9:45 p.m. The door to my mother's room had been open all day, and I never once noticed anything odd. Not a sound, not a flicker of movement, not the scent of a stranger. It was the same sick feeling I'd gotten when I realized Mitch hadn't been Mitch at all, that the imposter had been living in the walls, breathing my air, watching me sleep. They had been inside, right under my nose, and I hadn't known. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My hand, the one not trembling, went to my watch again, its familiar weight a paltry comfort. I climbed onto her bed, the soft mattress feeling like a trap, to inspect the pictures better, a morbid curiosity overriding every instinct to flee. I needed to see how they'd done it, needed to understand the impossible. Boom! I nearly screamed, a choked, pathetic sound. I shit you not. What sounded like a gunshot, or perhaps a small, controlled explosion, echoed from across the hall, directly from my own room. The sheer, unexpected violence of the noise, the concussive force of it, scared me so badly that I lost my footing on the bed, tumbling forward, my hand, outstretched in a desperate attempt to brace myself, slammed into the bed frame, then slid across the glass of one of the picture frames, now shattered from my fall. A sharp, searing pain shot up my arm as the broken glass bit deep into my palm. At this point, any sensible person would just leave, right? Any sane, self-preserving human being would have turned tail and bolted, screaming into the night. I knew I should have. My go bag, always packed and ready, was probably still by the door. My mind screamed at me to run, to sprint out of this nightmare house, this domestic tomb, but it felt like my body was being pulled, inexorably, towards my room, like an invisible string had been tethered to my chest, tugging me deeper into the abyss. It wasn't courage, it was a horrifying compulsion, a twisted form of my reluctant conscience, pulling me towards the source of the dread, perhaps because a part of me, the part that hated itself, felt I deserved to see the next horror. With my back pressed against the cold wall of the hallway, a sliver of broken glass still embedded in my palm, I slowly, excruciatingly slowly, opened the door to my room. A shriek, raw and involuntary, tore from my throat when I saw what was inside. It wasn't just a few things moved around, not a simple spot the differences game. It was a complete, utter upheaval. Everything was changed. Every damn thing in that room had been moved to a different area, rearranged into a chaotic, incomprehensible tableau. My bed, usually neatly made, was now against a different wall. My dresser was overturned, clothes spilling out like guts. It was a deliberate act of violation, a grotesque mockery of order. But amidst the chaos, there was only one thing out of place in a new, terrifying way. A folded piece of paper sat on my pillow, pristine white against the rumpled fabric. I walked numbly towards it, the broken glass in my hand a dull throb compared to the hammering of my heart. I unfolded the note. Let's get obvious. The handwriting was even worse than the previous note, almost frantic, as if scrawled in haste or intense excitement. As I put down the note, my gaze, drawn by an unseen force, drifted straight ahead. My bedroom is right next to our raised back porch, with sliding glass doors serving as the barrier between my sanctuary and the outside world. A knot the size of a bowling ball, cold and heavy, grew in my stomach as I looked at the small table on the porch, visible through the glass. Bob had been set up right in the middle of it. Bob. As a side job, my mother teaches CPR classes for the community, and Bob is one of the 7 life-size dummies we have for those sessions. He was supposed to be in the garage, stacked with his plastic brethren. Now, he was being propped up, eerily upright, by what looked like an old, rusty pipe jammed into his back. His rubber mouth, usually agape for artificial respiration, was now covered by a black leather ball gag, cinched tight, and worse, much worse, 2 gleaming, wickedly sharp hunting knives had been plunged into his plastic eyes, reflecting the dim porch light like malevolent stars. It was a mutilation, grotesque and deliberate, a horrifying tableau. But what scared me the most about Bob's performance was the message, scrawled crudely in red paint, or something that looked like it, on his torso. Locks couldn't keep us out. My blood ran cold. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. Not only had they been inside, not only had they meticulously rearranged and violated my space, but they had also done it with absolute impunity. The thought dragged me back to that empty, burned-out shell of a house in Sycamore Grove, the one I can barely remember, the one that should have protected my family. Locks, walls, doors. They meant nothing. They never had. Then, just as the full weight of that realization settled, I heard them, footsteps, under me, coming from the basement. My mouth slowly dropped open. A choked gasp caught in my throat. I froze, my every nerve ending screaming, trying to count the heavy, deliberate thuds. 1, 2, 3. From what I gathered in those 5 eternal seconds, 3 distinct sets of heavy, dragging footsteps were moving around down there, directly beneath me. Just like that, my body, usually so weary, kicked into a primal overdrive I hadn't felt since running from that hungry thing in the woods beyond the old farmhouse. No more reluctant conscience, no more morbid curiosity, pure, unadulterated survival. My go bag was probably still where I left it, but there was no time. I spun on my heel, sprinting out of my room, down the short hall, and towards the front door. Every fiber of my being screamed for open air, for escape. A cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I was scared out of my mind because the door to the basement, a heavy, bolted wooden slab, was practically beside the front door. They were between me and the only clear exit. My hand was already on the cold metal of the doorknob, twisting it, desperation clawing at my throat. I hadn't even looked out the peephole, hadn't registered anything beyond the blinding need to get out. But then I heard it, a low, gravelly voice, deceptively calm, from directly outside the door, just inches from my ear. "No, there's no leaving." I nearly got whiplash with how quickly my neck snapped upwards. My gaze shot to the front door's small, rectangular window, the kind you'd find on a suburban house. Standing there, silhouetted against the weak glow of the street lamp, was a very built person. They wore a plain blue mechanic's outfit, pristine and unblemished, and a stark, featureless white mask. The kind of blank, empty mask that chills you more than any ghoulish grin. It was too perfect, too clean, like the skin on Olivia's carpet, so neatly arranged, so horrifyingly human. It seemed like the 5 seconds we locked eyes through that pane of glass stretched into 5 hours, a lifetime of frozen terror. The blankness of the mask was a void, absorbing all light, all hope. But this person, this entity, broke that illusion of stasis when he suddenly, casually, slammed his fist into the door's window. Not only did this send a jolt of pure terror through my chest, giving me a mini heart attack, but it also produced a spiderweb of cracks across the glass. The thought of that blank-faced man, so easily breaching my last barrier, coming into my house, into my mother's house, into this space that was supposed to be safe, snapped me fully into survival mode. There was no fear to freeze me up, only a chilling, desperate clarity, an almost mechanical assessment of threat and escape to help me live through this. As I'm writing this, huddled in the borrowed warmth of a neighbor's guest room, I still don't know why I did what I did next. My lips, cold and numb, curled upwards. I smiled right at the man, a wide, unsettling grin, a desperate, defiant act of absurdity in the face of absolute terror. I knew that at least 4 men were either in my house or trying to get in, that the odds were stacked impossibly against me, but I smiled right into his damn blank face. It was the only shred of control I had left, a final middle finger to the cruel, indifferent universe that seemed determined to break me. Then, without breaking eye contact for another agonizing second, I turned around and started sprinting towards the back door. I could hear the man on my front porch yell, "Fuck!" as if he hadn't expected me to react, hadn't anticipated my suicidal defiance. Good. Let him be surprised. The back door, it felt miles away. My lungs burned, air rasping in and out, the smell of dust and old fear filling my nostrils. Once I reached the back door, yanking at the old deadbolt, I heard the heavy basement door creak open behind me, followed by a torrent of heavy, stomping footsteps. Closer now, gaining on me. But before they could even all get out of that damn door, I was already halfway down my backyard porch steps, clumsy and desperate. The cool night air hit my face, sharp and invigorating. Once I reached the bottom, I risked a glance behind me. The large, rusted gate that led into my backyard, usually bolted shut, was wide open, swaying slightly on its hinges. And standing in the gaping maw of the opening, silhouetted by the distant streetlights, was the man from earlier, the one in the mechanic's outfit and the white mask. This time he was brandishing a baseball bat, its dark gleam a promise of bone-shattering pain. I didn't even look again to see if he was chasing me, didn't wait to see if the others had spilled out of the house. I just ran. I sprinted towards my back fence, a rickety wooden barrier that separated my property from a patch of dense, neglected woods. My muscles screamed, but I launched myself, scrambling over the top, the rough wood scraping my already cut palm. I landed hard on the other side, a painful thud, and immediately started screaming for help, my voice raw and hoarse, tearing through the suffocating silence of the night. I barely registered the small patch of woods behind my house, the gnarled trees reaching like skeletal fingers. But luckily, by some miracle, a few teenagers were there, huddled around a dying bonfire, chugging hard iced tea and probably getting up to no good. My frantic screams, my disheveled appearance, and the terror plastered across my face must have been convincing enough. It didn't take much of my incoherent, panicked story to convince them to let me use their phone. The only girl there, a blonde with wide, shocked eyes, shoved hers into my trembling hand. I fumbled with it, dialing 911, my fingers slick with sweat and blood. I explained everything, the whole unbelievable, sanity-shattering nightmare, to the operator. She was calm, professional, telling me that squad cars were on their way, but that none of us were safe out in the open. "Find shelter, sir, immediately." So, and with a nod to the teenagers, we all ran, a desperate, terrified huddle, towards my neighbor's house. If you're reading this, Daryl, thank you for letting us in. You probably think I'm insane, but you let us in. The cops arrived 4 minutes later, sirens wailing, lights flashing, a brief, fragile beacon of hope in the darkness. They swept the house before doing anything else, guns drawn, flashlights cutting through the gloom. They didn't find anybody there. No blank-faced mechanic, no silent accomplices, no sign of the 3 sets of footsteps from the basement, but they did find a bunch of horrifying tools set up down there. The sheriff, a big man with weary eyes, described them in vague, chilling terms. Restraints, sharpening stones, some kind of staging area. They assumed that I must not have been paying attention to the basement much, that I was just a negligent house sitter who missed a meticulous home invasion. I tried to reassure them, tried to argue, my voice cracking with desperation. That's impossible, I insisted. I went down there today, around 8:30 p.m., to play Xbox. It was empty. There was nothing. The sheriff shook his head, a gesture of tired disbelief. That's impossible, son. The whole setup they had down there would have taken at least 3 hours to put together. Minimum. The time frame of the crime didn't add up for any of us. A gaping void in the narrative that defied logic. They also questioned how I didn't wake up when I was supposedly moved from my bed to the couch, or when they rearranged my entire house. Talking to them honestly felt like a really bad nightmare sequence from a David Lynch movie, a surreal, Kafka-esque interrogation. It didn't feel real. None of it did. The police, who weren't for all their authority, couldn't grasp the true nature of the violation. They saw a break-in. I saw the unraveling of reality. I'd dealt with authorities before. After that phantom hitchhiker incident, after the things I'd seen on the road, they always looked at me like I was a liar or a lunatic. Always. Most of the cops left around 11:45 p.m., leaving behind a single squad car parked outside in my driveway, a silent blue and white Guardian in case I needed them. I convinced my mom to stay on her cruise, assuring her everything was fine, that it was just some vandals. I felt a fragile sense of safety with the cop car sitting there, its presence a thin shield. Besides everything being moved, things felt relatively normal now, a strange, eerie calm after the storm. Until I entered the bathroom. It was a room where I hadn't spotted the difference. I hadn't dared. It was my last bastion of normalcy, or so I hoped. The fluorescent light hummed, casting a sterile glow. Then my eyes found the floor. Soap was all over it, like some deranged cleaner had gone wild. My shower curtain, a simple floral print, was shredded into long, hanging strips, like bloody ribbons. My breath caught. I saw a glint of white behind the toilet. My phone, the missing phone, it was there, wrapped neatly, meticulously, in toilet paper. And then I saw it, painted on the steamed-up mirror, in that same atrocious, desperate hand, was the final message. The punchline to the universe's cruelest joke: we are everywhere. We are everyone. No safe haven. I audibly said, "How the fuck?" The words were barely a whisper, a broken plea. My mind raced, trying to process it. Why wasn't this told to me by the police? Why was this room not brought up at all during their sweep? Had they missed it? Or had it happened after they left? A fresh wave of paranoia, colder and sharper than anything I'd felt tonight, washed over me. The cop car, the sense of safety. It was a lie. It was always a lie. My heart began to race again, a frantic hummingbird trapped in my chest. I ran, stumbling, into my living room, my gaze fixed on the front window. The squad car still sat in my driveway, a silent, mocking testament to my foolish belief in external protection. But it was empty. Nobody was in it. Instead, those two police uniforms, freshly folded, sat on the hood, catching the first pale light of dawn. They were an offering, a warning. I tried calling 911 again, my fingers fumbling with the toilet paper-wrapped phone, but it wasn't working. Dead. No signal. My neighbors, Daryl and his wife, weren't home, even though they had been 30 minutes ago. 30 minutes. Enough time for anything to happen. I'm not trying to write a cliche, the author dies at the end story, because right now, as the sun begins to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in sickeningly cheerful hues, I'm very much alive. My hand throbs, my muscles ache, and my mind feels like shattered glass. But I'm worried that I won't be for much longer. If I somehow survive this, I want to share my story, I want to ask all of you, out there in the vast, indifferent darkness, if you have ever been in a situation like this one where everything almost feels normal, where the pieces seem to fit, but in fact, everything, every subtle change, every deliberate violation, every single second of it seems to be contributing to your death. This isn't just a house invasion. This is a message, and I am its unwilling recipient. Character count 987. The guttural roar tore through the lingering haze of my concussion, a sound born of pure, protective rage. Lucy, the 80-pound American bulldog, was a blur of muscle and teeth. Her jaws clamped down on the intruder's arm with a ferocity that made my stomach churn. Blood, thick and dark as crude oil, welled around her muzzle, painting her white fur a grotesque crimson. Near his legs, Coco, the tiny dachshund, was a snarling, snapping whirlwind of defiance. A pocket-sized demon unleashed. The second man, the one who'd blindsided me with a goddamn metal detector, screamed, a sound that was less human and more like something feral caught in a trap. My vision swam, each beat of my heart a painful throb behind my eyes. But the glint of the dropped pistol on the polished marble floor was enough to cut through the fog. I pushed myself up, every joint protesting, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the weapon. One more, just one more bullet to end this. It had all built to this. Of course, it always did. The quiet creep of dread, the small, unsettling details, the internal debate between self-preservation and that damned, persistent spark of a conscience. It had started weeks earlier, with a phone call and a favor I knew I should have refused. My brother, Mark, was always the one who chased the sun in the spotlight, a self-proclaimed titan of industry, or at least, that's what he called himself when he was trying to borrow money for a new sports car. He lived in a monument to his own fragile ego, a sprawling, glass and marble suburban palace that reeked of new money and stale ambition. When he called, his voice bright and breezy, asking if I could house sit and dog sit for a few weeks while he jetted off to some exotic locale, my first instinct was to just hang up. I was good at that now, good at severing connections, at making myself invisible. Years of moving, of living out of a go bag, of late-night warehouse shifts and solitary drives across state lines, had honed that instinct to a razor edge. I was the weary wanderer, the haunted everyman who just wanted to be left alone. But then he mentioned the dogs. Lucy, the bulldog, and Coco, the pint-sized dynamo, and that damned persistent conscience of mine, a real fatal flaw in my otherwise perfectly honed survival strategy. Snagged. He wasn't asking me, Leo Vance, his perpetually drifting, vaguely unsettling younger brother, to protect him. He was asking me to protect two creatures who couldn't protect themselves. Great, I thought, a sarcastic sneer twisting my lip as I listened to his overly casual assurances. Another fine mess you've gotten yourself into. Vance, just like that snow-choked mountain pass, just like that diner where I almost became someone's supper. I was always on the move, a ghost in my own life, trying to outrun the echoes of a past that refused to fade. Truck driving, graveyard shifts as a security guard in empty office parks, whatever paid the bills and kept me anonymous. Mark's place, despite its suburban opulence, was supposed to be just another temporary stop, a quiet eddy in the current of my perpetual flight. A teacher, he'd said, right, that was a lifetime ago, before the world decided to carve me open and root around in my insides. Before the Sycamore Grove fire, the house itself felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. Too clean, too quiet, too perfect, like a freshly painted set piece waiting for the real drama to unfold. It gave me the same cold prickle of unease that Olivia's pristine, antique-filled mansion had, that carefully curated beauty, often a thin veneer over something far more rotten. I checked my old analog wristwatch, more out of habit than need. the worn leather strap a familiar comfort against my skin. Time stretched here, distorting into something formless. The dogs were indeed an odd pairing. Lucy, the American bulldog, a magnificent brute of a creature, all muscle and mournful eyes, weighed in at a solid 80 pounds. Her presence was a low hum of power, a contained storm. Coco, the dachshund, was her polar opposite, a tiny bundle of neurotic energy, a yapping shadow that followed Lucy everywhere. My instructions were simple: feed, water, and ensure Lucy didn't turn any delivery men into chew toys. Their constant, low-level chaos was, ironically, the only thing that kept the oppressive silence of the house from completely swallowing me whole. Mark, for all his outward-facing success, was a slob of monumental proportions. He'd explicitly forbidden me from entering his master bedroom or the guest room, citing personal embarrassment. Given the faint, cloying scent of stale weed that sometimes wafted from upstairs, and the vague, ominous way he'd described those rooms as wastelands of discarded clothes and questionable food remnants, I wasn't exactly pushing for a tour. The living room and kitchen were passably cluttered, a thin layer of dust on surfaces that marble probably wasn't designed for. My days quickly settled into a routine of profound boredom. I'd wander the echoing hallways, flick through Mark's utterly abysmal cable channels, poke at his ancient PS2, who still owned a PS2, and raid his ridiculously well-stocked pantry. The emptiness of my own life, which I usually managed to keep at bay with constant movement, pressed in on me here, amplified by the sterile, suburban quiet. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a held breath, waiting. The only place I found any semblance of peace was the basement. Mark used it as a sort of glorified man cave, complete with a surprisingly comfortable old couch and a decent TV. It was relatively clean, probably because he spent so little time down there. It became my sanctuary, my little pocket of normalcy in a house that increasingly felt off. Mark had a security camera app on his phone, and he'd installed cameras at the front and back doors. For the first few days, and it was a constant source of low-level irritation. The app would ping incessantly. Motion detected, front door. Motion detected, back door. Every time I checked, there was nothing. Just the empty porch, the placid backyard. I put it down to faulty sensors, maybe a stray cat or a strong gust of wind. The mundane repetition of false alarms lulled me into a false sense of security, which, in my experience, is always the prelude to something truly nasty. Then came the third night. I was down in the basement, trying to lose myself in some ancient video game that involved a lot of pixelated running and jumping, when it started. Crack. A single sharp sound, like a stone hitting glass. My fingers froze on the controller. The silence, already heavy, seemed to absorb the sound, then echo it, amplifying its unnaturalness. Crack, crack. Not random, not accidental. Deliberate, calculated. Each strike a cold, precise chisel against the fragile paint of my composure. My breath hitched. The air around me seemed to thicken, a metallic tang of ozone pricking at the back of my throat. It wasn't just noise. It was an ominous knock, a deliberate summons from something unseen. It sent a jolt, cold and electric, straight through my chest, pulling me back to that snow-choked mountain pass, to the memory of a dead man's impossible whisper that had followed me for days. I sat there, frozen, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Crack. This time, it seemed impossibly close, vibrating through the very foundation of the house. From upstairs, Lucy let out a low, rumbling growl that quickly escalated into a ferocious bark. Coco, never one to be outdone, joined in with a series of frantic, high-pitched yaps. Their fear was contagious. I fumbled for my phone, my thumb slick with sweat as I opened the security app. Front door, empty. Back door, still. quiet. My mind screamed in protest. It's nothing. It's a faulty sensor. You're just jumpy. Vance, the trauma. It's making you see things. But the dogs weren't jumpy. They were terrified. I grabbed the heavy mag light from my go bag, its beam a comforting weight in my hand, and clipped my old 9mm to my belt, just in case. My feet felt heavy on the basement stairs, each step a reluctant commitment to confronting whatever was out there. I moved through the house, a phantom in the dark, checking every window, every door, locked. All of them. My breath hitched when I saw the back door, its deadbolt firmly set, but my eyes snagged on something outside. A ladder, propped carelessly against the back of the house, leaning against the second-story window of what I assumed was the guest room. Relief warred with a nagging unease. Relief, because it meant no one had gotten in. Unease, because why was it there? Mark wasn't the kind to leave things unsecured. I dismissed it, forcing myself to accept the explanation of my own paranoia. But the image of that ladder, stark against the pale moonlight, refused to leave me. When I called Mark, he was annoyingly nonchalant. Oh, that old thing? House is poorly built. Leo, creaks and groans. Probably just the wind. His dismissal grated on my already frayed nerves. He sounded just like the endless parade of doctors and cops who told me my experiences were just stress or hallucinations. They'd never seen the things I'd seen, the things that lived behind charming smiles, or the ones that peeled off human skin like a discarded garment. His indifference didn't ease my mind. It only solidified my growing distrust of anything that seemed normal. Over the next few days, a new kind of unease settled in. It was a faint, intermittent static, a barely perceptible hiss that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was only audible when the house was utterly silent, a phantom whisper, like a broken radio tuning itself to a frequency only I could hear. It reminded me, unpleasantly, of the way the air had felt wrong in that house with Mitch, before I found out he wasn't Mitch at all, before the walls started to breathe. The house wasn't just quiet, it was listening. Adding to the creeping dread was the dog's behavior. Lucy, usually a restless guardian, became lethargic, her mournful eyes heavy-lidded. Coco, who normally buzzed with energy, spent most of her time curled in a tight ball, shivering faintly even when the house was warm. They slept almost non-stop, their usual boisterous greetings replaced by tired blinks. It was as if some vital spark had been drained from them. I chalked it up to stress, maybe the change in environment, but a gut feeling, honed by too many encounters with the inexplicable, screamed otherwise. Something was wrong. I scheduled a vet appointment, bracing myself for some dire diagnosis. Perfectly healthy, the vet said, after a thorough examination. Perhaps the excitement of your presence has simply worn them out. She smiled, a professional, reassuring smile that did nothing to soothe the cold knot in my stomach. The dogs knew. They always knew. It's the quiet Vance, I thought, running a hand over Lucy's listless head. The quiet always puts you on edge. It's what came before the growls of that pig thing. What came before the mirror showed you something that wasn't you. By the second week, the house felt less like a temporary sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. The security app pinged relentlessly now, a constant, annoying symphony of phantom motion alerts. And the static, it was louder now, a persistent, low-frequency hum that vibrated in my teeth, a constant pressure behind my eyes. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Each rustle of the leaves outside, each creak of the old house, sending my heart into a frantic drum solo against my ribs. Exhaustion finally took its toll one night, and I must have collapsed on the couch in the basement, the mag light still clutched in my hand, the pistol resting beside me. I woke with a jolt, not to the pings of the app, but to something far more visceral, the unmistakable sound of heavy, Deliberate footsteps. They weren't coming from outside. They were coming from above me. From the off-limits rooms, my blood ran cold. My brother's personal embarrassment now felt less like a quirky habit and more like a carefully constructed barrier. The air in the basement, usually a comfort, now felt thick with a presence that wasn't mine. The dogs, roused by the same sounds, were whimpering softly, their tails tucked tight between their legs. I moved slowly, deliberately, adrenaline a cold, clear rush through my veins. Every nerve ending was on fire. I picked up the pistol, its weight suddenly familiar, comforting. My old leather jacket, always within reach, felt like a second skin as I pulled it on. Each step on the basement stairs was a creak, amplified 100-fold in the terrifying silence of the house. The oppressive weight of dread grew with every footfall. The static in the walls seemed to hum louder, mocking me. It was like walking into a memory, a nightmare I'd already lived. The house itself breathing around me. The walls have eyes, Vance, and sometimes they have teeth. The first floor was empty, thankfully. The dogs huddled behind me, their soft whimpers the only sound besides my own ragged breathing. The staircase to the second floor felt impossibly long, an ascent into a nightmare. My hand, slick with sweat, gripped the cold railing. Don't be a hero. Vance, just get out. Leave the dogs. Leave the house. Run. But the whimpers of Lucy and Coco, the thought of them abandoned to whatever was up there, snapped that cynical thought. My reluctant conscience, always a step behind my good sense, pulled me forward. The master bedroom door stood ajar, revealing a chaotic landscape of discarded clothes, takeout containers, and what looked suspiciously like a half-eaten pizza on the floor. It was exactly as Mark had described, a monument to unhygienic living. My gaze swept through the room, searching for movement, for a sign, but found nothing but stagnant air and dust motes dancing in the weak moonlight filtering through the curtains. The guest room was next. Its door was also slightly ajar, almost invitingly so. I pushed it open slowly, pistol raised, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The room was less chaotic than the master, but a disturbing sense of wrongness permeated the air. It felt lived in, but not by Mark. My eyes scanned the room, noticing small details, a faint scuff mark on the pristine wall, a barely perceptible indentation on the carpet near the window. And then I saw it, the closet door. It was open just a crack, a sliver of deeper darkness within the dim room. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, but that damned conscience, fueled by the cold dread coiling in my gut, pulled me forward. I pushed the door open, slowly, bracing for impact. The closet was small, unassuming, but inside, a small window, easily missed, stared back at me. And the glass, it wasn't broken. It had been carefully, meticulously cut, the edges precise, almost surgical, and then replaced, perfectly, seamlessly, as if nothing had ever been amiss. A ghost window. My gaze dropped to the floor beneath it. There were candy wrappers, crumpled and dry, an empty water bottle, and a grimy folded blanket. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, cold shard of ice. Not just someone passing through. Someone had been living here for days, weeks, right under my nose. In the walls. Vance, they're always in the walls. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a chilling confirmation of the insidious paranoia that had been gnawing at me. This wasn't just a home invasion. It was an infestation. It brought back the sickening memory of Mitch, the friend who wasn't, the one whose face had been a mask, and the lurking presence that had made the very air in that house feel diseased. Panic, cold and nauseating, seized me. My fingers fumbled for my phone, already dialing 911, the numbers blurring through the adrenaline fog. But then I hesitated. My thumb hovered over the keypad. What if I'm wrong? The whisper of self-doubt. A familiar companion snaked its way into my mind. What if it's just Mark's mess? What if I'm overreacting, seeing monsters where there are none? It wasn't the first time my sanity had been called into question. The memory of bewildered doctors and dismissive cops still a raw wound. The embarrassment of a baseless call, the humiliation of being seen as crazy, warred with the primal urge to flee. My mind raced through possibilities, weighing the risks, the ridicule. Then the phone buzzed, vibrating violently in my trembling hand, tearing through my internal debate like a chainsaw through paper. Motion detected. Front door. The message flashed, stark white on the screen. My hesitation vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. The sound followed instantly, deafening, splintering. A grotesque symphony of shattering glass and splintering wood echoed through the house, seeming to tear the very fabric of the air. I didn't need the security app to tell me what was happening. I heard it. The house was being violated. I stumbled back, adrenaline pumping, my vision narrowing to a tunnel. Through the now gaping hole where the front door had been, a figure emerged. Tall, broad, his face obscured by a skull-printed balaclava, the macabre grin seeming to mock me from the darkness. He held a crowbar, thick and heavy, like an extension of his own malevolent will. He was prying the door open further, stepping over the splintered frame. There was no time to think, no time to analyze it, just instinct. I raised the pistol. Bang! The report ripped through the silence, deafening in the enclosed space. The man grunted, a strangled choke sound, and crumpled to the ground, a heap of black clothing and skull mask. Relief, sharp and fleeting, pierced through the terror. But it lasted only a fraction of a second. From behind me, a sudden, blinding flash of pain exploded in the back of my head. The world tilted, spun, then went black. I heard the frantic, desperate barks of Lucy and Coco, then nothing. I woke to chaos. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that felt like someone was trying to hammer a railroad spike through my skull. My vision swam, but the scene before me was undeniable. Lucy, my 80-pound guardian angel, was a snarling, tearing beast. Her jaws clamped down on the second man's arm. He screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound that was quickly muffled by her powerful body. Coco, true to her miniature terror form, was latched onto his leg, a tiny, furious extension of Lucy's rage. Blood was everywhere, slick on the polished marble, painting a morbid fresco. The second intruder thrashed, trying to dislodge Lucy, but she was a force of nature, unyielding. My pistol lay a few feet away, glinting innocently in the dim light. I pushed myself up, every muscle screaming in protest, and crawled towards it. My hands trembled, but there was a cold, hard resolve in my chest. This ends now. I grabbed the gun, aimed, and fired the remaining rounds. The intruder went limp, his thrashing ceasing abruptly. A sickening finality settled over the scene. My hands shook, an uncontrollable tremor that ran through my entire body. I sat on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been a pristine entryway. The metallic tang of blood thick in the air, the dogs panting heavily beside me. Lucy nudged her massive head against my arm, a rumbling purr in her chest. Coco licked my hand, her small body trembling with residual adrenaline. The gravity of the situation crashed over me, a tidal wave of exhaustion and disbelief. The sirens were already wailing in the distance, a growing crescendo that promised the arrival of the cavalry. Or, in my experience, more trouble. The police arrived moments later, a chaotic storm of flashing lights, shouted orders, and drawn weapons. In the confusion, a blur of uniforms and startled faces, a single officer, adrenaline fueled and mistaking my pistol for a continued threat, fired. A searing hot pain tore through my side. I remember the shock, The almost ludicrous irony. Of course, even after the monsters were dealt with, the mundane world still found a way to screw me over. Thankfully, it was a superficial wound, a graze more than a direct hit. The world, it seemed, wasn't done with me yet, not even the normal parts. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights, antiseptic smells, and well-meaning but ultimately clueless medical staff. They stitched me up, pumped me full of painkillers, and asked questions I didn't want to answer. But it was there, amidst the beeping machines and hushed whispers, that the full, sickening truth unraveled. Mark, my dear brother, the architect of this suburban nightmare, had stolen a significant stash of cocaine from a drug cartel. He'd hidden it in his house, using me, his unwitting brother, as a convenient, disposable shield. The intruders hadn't been random. They had been hunting for their merchandise. And the dogs? They hadn't just been worn out. The intruders had drugged them to keep them docile, to ensure they wouldn't interfere with their search. The image of their lethargy, the vet's confused diagnosis, clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. The betrayal was a bitter pill, colder and sharper than any bullet wound. Mark, who I had, despite everything, still held some vestige of brotherly affection for, had used me as a pawn in a game I hadn't even known was being played. He'd put my life, and the lives of Lucy and Coco, in jeopardy for his own greedy, reckless schemes. The trust I'd placed in him, already thin as a worn dollar bill, shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. It was another reminder that the most monstrous appetites often wore the most charming faces. A lesson Ethan had taught me, in his own sickening way. But amidst the rubble of my shattered trust, there was a fierce, bright beacon. Lucy and Coco. Their loyalty, their pure, unadulterated courage in the face of absolute terror, had saved my life. Lucy's growls, like thunder rolling through the chaos, were a visceral reminder of her determination, a solid wall of iron between me and death. Coco, small but fierce, was a burning ember of defiance, her bravery outshining her diminutive size. Their actions weren't just instinct, they were declarations of loyalty, carved into the very fabric of that night. They weren't just pets, they were my protectors, my allies, the only beings in that moment who had genuinely cared whether I lived or died. The shared terror, the crucible of that suburban house, had forged a bond between us that felt almost sacred, a connection deeper than any blood tie. I'd seen the worst of humanity in those hours, but I'd also seen the best of something else entirely. I've since left that stater, of course, burned the bridge, cut the wires, changed the ghost of my name. I took Lucy and Coco with me. They're my shadows now, my constant companions. Lucy, a comforting weight, often rests her massive head on my lap, her deep, rumbling purr a balm to my frayed nerves. Coco, ever vigilant, curls up at my feet, a warm, soft presence. Their warmth is a stark contrast to the bone-deep cold of fear that once gripped me, a testament to the bond we forged. They sleep by my bed each night, guardians against the darkness, and my trusty 9mm, now fully loaded and within arm's reach, ensures I'll never be caught off guard again. I don't trust any haven anymore, not after seeing that even the idea of heaven itself was just a cosmic farm. This world, no matter how quiet or peaceful it seems, is a hostile place, always ready to spring a trap. But the memories of that house cling to me like smoke, thick and suffocating, a constant reminder of how close I came to losing everything. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the silence presses in, I swear I can still hear it, the static whispering through the walls, faint but unmistakable, like a radio trying to find a signal from another dimension. The shadows outside my window, stretched long by some unseen light, seem to twist and coil, forming shapes that dissolve when I blink, like the shifting reflections in a broken mirror. I tell myself it's just my imagination, the echoes of trauma playing tricks on my mind, the lingering effects of the curse that clings to me. But deep down, I know the truth. That house wasn't just a chapter in my life. It left a mark, an open wound that hasn't healed. It cemented something deep inside me. The hunt is becoming more personal, more direct, no longer just random encounters. And sometimes, I wonder if the story truly ended when I left, or if it's simply waiting, patient and malevolent, for the right moment to begin again. The muzzle flash bit the oppressive darkness, a brief, blinding bloom of orange that seared itself onto my retinas. The Mossberg bucked against my shoulder, a familiar, brutal recoil, and the sound of the shot was less a crack and more a visceral, percussive thump against the stillness of the midnight field. Something heavy dropped in the tall grass, a sound like a sack of wet bricks, followed by a choked gurgle that ended abruptly, leaving only the wind's low moan as a witness. My breath hitched. A jagged shard of fear lodged in my throat, but my hands were steady. They always were, even when the rest of me felt like a quivering mess of frayed nerves and cold dread. The old soldier in me still knew how to pull a trigger. One down, two more to go. Or was it three? Hell, I was losing count in the sudden, sickening clarity of violence. This was it, then. The moment all those whispered warnings in the dark corners of my mind had been building toward the end of the quiet, the beginning of whatever fresh hell the universe had decided to dump on my weary doorstep this time. Just another Tuesday, or rather, a Saturday night, and for a world-weary wanderer like me, one desolate, forgotten stretch of highway was much like any other. My current gig was a short-term, low-profile security detail for a modular home way out in the sticks, a place so remote even the crickets seemed bored. The owners, some corporate types, were out of state, so it was just me, the echoing silence, and a paycheck that barely covered gas and cheap coffee. A few nights of watching empty fields under a sky so vast it felt like a heavy blanket pressing down, and I'd be gone. That was the plan, anyway. Plans rarely survived contact with my reality. I'd rolled in late Tuesday afternoon, the kind of late that meant the sun was already bleeding orange and purple over the horizon, painting the endless flatlands in hues of tired resignation. The house itself was a sprawling, prefab monstrosity, all angles and vinyl siding, dropped onto a 5-acre parcel of nothing. It felt less like a home and more like a landlocked ship, listing slightly in a sea of overgrown prairie grass. I'd parked my beat-up truck out of sight, my go bag already on the passenger seat, a silent promise to myself that I was always ready to bolt. The air had a strange, metallic tang to it that night, like ozone, even without a storm brewing. I remembered pulling my worn leather jacket tighter around me, a useless gesture against a chill that wasn't from the air. My old analog wristwatch, a nervous tick more than a timepiece, felt heavier on my wrist than usual. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, playing tricks on a mind already worn thin by too many miles and too many bad memories. The first oddity came a few hours later. Dusk had long since fallen, swallowing the fields whole and leaving only the distant, indifferent glitter of stars. I was inside doing my rounds, a lukewarm mug of coffee cradled in my hands. The house was cavernous, sterile without its occupants, and every creak of the floorboards under my weight, every groan of settling wood, seemed magnified. I just stepped past the entrance to the garage, heading deeper into the empty bedrooms, when I heard it, a sharp, resounding thud. The sound of the interior garage door, slamming shut, not just closing, but slamming, like someone had put their shoulder into it. My first thought, because my brain is wired for immediate cynicism, was that the wind had caught it, but there was no wind that night, not enough to violently swing a heavy door. I'd closed it myself, firmly, less than an hour ago. I called out, a reflex more than a real expectation. "Hello?" The word hung in the air, flat and meaningless, then vanished into the silence. No response. My hand instinctively went to the Walther PPQ holstered at my hip. Just nerves, I told myself. Too many late nights, too many bad stories. Still, I methodically swept the house, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, its stark white eye dissecting every shadow. Kitchen, living room, all 5 bedrooms, even the oversized bathrooms. Nothing. Just dust motes dancing in the beam and the hollow echo of my own movements. The unsettling stillness lingered, though a thick, suffocating blanket that wrapped around the house, as if the very walls were holding their breath. It felt watched. I spent the rest of the night nursing a fresh cup of coffee and trying to convince myself it was nothing. My own paranoia, a familiar old friend, just coming to call. The feeling persisted into Friday. The air felt heavier, laden with an unnameable tension that tightened my chest. I kept checking the perimeter, walking the fence line, looking for signs of anything amiss. The field stretched out, innocent enough under the harsh glare of the midday sun, but I knew what they became when night fell. A void, a place where anything could hide. I even managed to flag down a neighbor, some grizzled old farmer named Stephen who occasionally drove his ancient pickup down the dirt road. We talked about the weather, the price of feed, the usual small-town banalities. Just as I was about to dismiss myself, he offhandedly mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He'd seen a black SUV, driving slowly along the road, headlights off, in the early hours of Thursday morning. "Real strange for around here, son," he drawled, spitting a wad of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Don't get much traffic, especially not the quiet kind." He just shrugged and drove off, leaving me standing there, a fresh knot of dread tightening in my gut. The garage door, the SUV. No coincidence. Nothing in my life ever was. Saturday night arrived like a predator, slow and deliberate, its shadow stretching across the land. I spent the entire day on edge, every little sound making me jump. The house felt less like a temporary sanctuary and more like a pressure cooker. I'd moved my duffel bags, the main one and the ever-ready go bag, right by the back door, just in case. Call it instinct, or just the accumulated wisdom of a man who'd seen too much. I checked my Walter, chambered around, checked the Mossberg. I hadn't seen the black SUV yet, but I knew it was coming. The certainty of it was a leaden weight in my stomach. Midnight came, bringing with it a profound silence, broken only by the frantic beat of my own heart. I was in the living room, perched on the edge of a surprisingly uncomfortable armchair, staring out the window that overlooked the long, empty drive. The moon was a sliver, thin and cold, offering little light. Then, from far down the road, a low rumble, a sound that vibrated through the very soles of my worn boots. It started faint, a distant hum, then grew, like a living thing drawing closer. My chest tightened, a familiar vice. Here we go. I pressed my face closer to the glass, breath fogging the pain. The black SUV was there, a shapeless mass against the darker backdrop of the night. It crept along, headlights still off, a silent hunter. It slowed, its engine's low growl vibrating through the still night, a monstrous purr. Then it stopped, not in the driveway, but about 200 yards down the road, just where the fields started to open up on either side. My pulse hammered in my ears, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. 3 figures emerged from the vehicle, their silhouettes barely distinguishable against the dim, moonlit field. They moved with a chilling precision, not walking but jogging, almost a sprint, across the open expanse with alarming speed. They were closing the distance too fast. My breath caught, and a wave of pure, unadulterated dread surged through me, cold and unrelenting, a familiar friend in these situations. One of them, the lead figure, cradled something long and dark. As he drew closer, a faint gleam of moonlight caught its barrel. A shotgun. My hand went to my wristwatch, thumb tracing the cold metal of the casing. A tick, a grounding mechanism. Useless. This can't be happening. I whispered, the words trembling and thin in the empty room. Not again, but it was. It always was. I wasn't just a magnet for trouble. I was a damn beacon. I'd taken this gig to disappear, to just fade into the background. And here I was, about to get into a firefight with what looked like a damn militia in the middle of nowhere. My fault, really. Should have just bolted when I heard that garage door. That was the smart move. The Leo Vance move. But no, the stupid, stubborn part of me, the part I called my reluctant conscience, had to stick it out, had to see it through. What was I protecting anyway? Empty rooms? The corporate fat cats who didn't even know I existed? This was my fatal flaw, the rotten core of decency that kept dragging me into other people's nightmares. Or maybe my own. I moved, a low growl escaping my lips. My feet knew the way, guided by years of muscle memory. I snatched the Mossberg 9200 from where I'd left it leaning against the wall by the back door, its weight of brutal comfort in my hands. The cold steel felt good, familiar. I thumbed off the safety. No time for tactical genius, just pure primal defense. A sudden, sharp crack. The sound of breaking glass. It pierced the oppressive silence, sharp and jarring, echoing through the empty house. They'd shattered a window in the garage, not even bothering with the door. Bold, or stupid, probably both. I could hear their muffled footsteps now, heavy thuds against the concrete floor of the garage, then moving into the house. Low, guttural voices, muffled commands. They were inside. My breath hitched. They were searching, methodical and deliberate, their every movement steeped in sinister intent. I pressed myself against the wall next to the garage entrance. Just out of sight, my senses sharpened, the world narrowing to the faint creaks of the floorboards, the scrape of boots, the ominous approach of my unseen enemies. Fear gripped me, primal and all-consuming, a cold serpent coiling in my stomach, but beneath it lay a simmering, stubborn resolve. This was my job, for now, and I wasn't about to let some armed thugs just walk in. Not on my watch. The hallway light, a sickly yellow glow, flickered on near the bedrooms, casting long, warped shadows that seemed to dance with malice. They were getting closer. Their voices grew clearer, rough, impatient. I heard the distinct clack-clack of a shotgun being racked. My heart hammered against my ribs, a drum solo of pure adrenaline. My grip tightened on the Mossberg. My worn leather jacket felt suddenly heavier, a flimsy shield against the coming storm. The steps paused right outside the bedroom adjacent to where I was hiding. A brief, tense silence. Then, a low voice, almost a whisper, but it carried in the dead air. "Clear!" One of them moved. The door to the bedroom slowly creaked open. That was my cue. As the lead man stepped through the doorway, his silhouette momentarily framed by the dim light, I acted. There was no thought, only instinct, honed by years of running and surviving. The Mossberg leaped to my shoulder, and I fired, not once, but 3 times in quick succession. The first round caught him square in the chest. I heard the wet thump of the impact, saw his body recoil, a puppet with severed strings. The second shot caught him higher, and he crumpled, a lifeless heap. The third was pure overkill, tearing into the wall behind him. The acrid smell of gunpowder instantly filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of fresh fear. Chaos erupted. His companions, caught completely off guard, panicked. I heard a choked cry, a curse. One scrambled, bolting for the front door. Another darted back toward the garage, their movements clumsy in their terror. My hand went to my hip, drawing the Walther PPQ. I didn't waste time on the first one. Let him run. I spun, tracking the one heading for the garage. He was almost out the interior door when I got a clean shot. The Walther barked twice, a grunt of pain, a stumble, and he went down. Not dead, but definitely out of the fight. My breath was coming in ragged gasps now. each one a burning rasp in my throat. I could feel the cold sweat plastering my hair to my forehead, dripping down my spine. The house, once silent, now rang with the echoes of gunfire, the frantic beat of my heart, and the distant, fading sound of someone running. Not finished. I didn't know how many there were, but I wasn't about to let the last one escape. Not if they were coming back. Not if they knew who was here. Adrenaline was a raw, fiery current in my veins. My mind, usually clouded by cynicism, was sharpened to a razor's edge. I retrieved my SKS rifle from its place next to the Mossberg, heavier, longer, but with more reach. I sprinted through the house past the inert figure in the garage doorway and burst out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap. My boots pounded on the damp earth as I ran, scanning the field. The black SUV was still there, a patient, dark presence, and a figure, a shadowy blur, was scrambling towards it, limping, clearly wounded. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice raw, ragged, carrying far across the open field. The figure paused, startled, then turned. I raised the SKS. There was no hesitation, no moral dilemma. This was survival. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, a deeper, more resonant sound than the pistol or the shotgun. I fired until the figure went down, a final, lifeless collapse into the whispering grass. He didn't move again. My chest burned, lungs aching with the exertion. I stood there, legs trembling, the rifle heavy in my hands, scanning the desolate fields. Nothing. No more movement. Just the vast, indifferent darkness and the metallic tang of cordite on the wind. It was over. For now. By the time the sheriff's cruiser, a single, lonely beacon of blue and red, pulled up the long drive, the intruders lay motionless, their black SUV riddled with bullet holes. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, gun smoke, and something else, something metallic and sickeningly sweet. I recounted the harrowing ordeal, my voice hoarse, my ears ringing, my body trembling as the adrenaline drained away, leaving me cold and hollow. The sheriff, a lean man with tired eyes, listened patiently, jotting notes. He looked at me, then at the bodies, then back at me. He didn't say much, just nodded, his gaze lingering a moment too long. "Self-defense," he mumbled, more to himself than to me. "Looks clear." Clear. Nothing was ever clear. They called in backup. More cruisers arrived, their flashing lights strobing across the fields, painting the scene in a macabre disco of red and blue. Paramedics, then a coroner. It was a whole damn party. I stood back, watching them work, a grim, detached observer. My hands were still shaking, but I forced them into the pockets of my jacket, a pathetic attempt at normalcy. I felt nothing but a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull me under. This was just another chapter in the long, bloody book of my life. Another house, another incident, another reason to pack up and keep moving. The phantom itch under my skin, the constant awareness of being watched, just got a fresh coat of paint. Days later, I returned to the house, an unspoken agreement with the sheriff to retrieve my belongings now that the forensic teams had cleared out. The police tape was gone, but the scent of antiseptic and something faintly sickly still clung to the air. The silence inside felt unnatural, like the house itself was holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards, every sway of the curtains, brought back flashes of that terrifying night, as though the memories were etched into the very walls. It was a place forever changed, its transient safety replaced by an ominous stillness, a palpable sense of violated space. I walked through the rooms, the ghost of gunfire still echoing in my ears, picking up my few possessions. My go bag felt heavier than usual, each item a reminder of the life I'd chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen me. As I crossed the threshold, about to step out for good, my phone buzzed, the cheap, burner phone I use for these one-off jobs. The screen displayed an unknown number. My stomach twisted. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. It was probably just the property management company, confirming my departure, or maybe the sheriff with some follow-up. But a colder, more primal part of my brain screamed, "Don't answer it!" My reluctant conscience, or maybe just a morbid curiosity, won out. Trembling, I answered. Only silence greeted me. Thick, empty, suffocating silence. I held the phone away from my ear, staring at the blank screen, then brought it back, pressing it tight against my ear. "Hello?" I muttered, my voice thin and reedy in the echoing emptiness of the house. Then, faint, barely a whisper, but clear as a bell, it came, a voice, dry, like rustling leaves, cold as a tombstone, and utterly devoid of anything human. "It's not over." The words sent an icy chill down my spine, a sensation that started in my coccyx and exploded into a million pinpricks across my skin. I stumbled back, dropping the phone. It clattered on the hardwood floor, a cheap plastic thing, now dark and lifeless. My breath quickened, ragged and shallow, as I stared at it, lying there like a forgotten toy. Had I imagined it? The ringing in my ears, the lingering adrenaline, the exhaustion. Was it just my mind playing tricks? No. The dread gripping my chest was too real, too visceral. It wasn't a trick. The house's shadows seemed to deepen, shifting as though alive, twisting into malevolent shapes in my peripheral vision. The air grew heavy, colder. A thought, ancient and terrifying, clawed its way into my mind, one I couldn't shake. The nightmare hadn't ended. It was waiting, watching, and it wasn't just these thugs. This was something else, something more, and I might never truly escape. The line went dead, the silence it left behind more terrifying than any scream. I picked up the phone, shoved it into my pocket, and walked out the door. Not looking back. Another town. Another job. Another haunting. The Chronicles of Leo Vance had just begun. Character count, 9,879. The world exploded in a symphony of splintering wood and a sound like a wet sack of concrete hitting stone. Only the concrete was me. Agony, a white-hot spear, lanced through my spine as the desk above me buckled, its cheap particle board screaming in protest before giving way. My vision blurred, a kaleidoscope of fluorescent light and impossible shadow, as the immense calloused fist of the creature that was no longer Julia drove the collapsing furniture down onto my already paralyzed body. Air, or what little I had left in my lungs, roared out in a desperate, ragged gasp, tasting of fear and the acrid tang of ozone. Every cell in my body screamed for release, for the sweet oblivion of unconsciousness. But it wouldn't come. Not yet. This, I knew with a chilling certainty that pierced even the pain, was exactly how it ended. Again, this particular brand of hell, of course, hadn't started with a fist the size of a Thanksgiving turkey or the pulverizing weight of office furniture. It began, as these things always do, with a seemingly innocuous offer of a job, a fresh start in a place far enough from the last that the echoes of what I'd seen there might just fade into static, a chance to be just another ghost in the machine, clocking in and out, pretending the world wasn't a farm for something monstrous. The transfer papers to the new redacted restaurant group location had felt like a reprieve, a slip of paper promising anonymity. It was a smaller outpost, tucked away off a forgotten highway, its neon sign flickering like a dying pulse in the vast, empty expanse of nowhere. Perfect. No prying eyes, no familiar faces, just grease, the hum of industrial refrigerators, and the blessed quiet of the graveyard shift. That's all I ever asked for. A corner of the world where the screaming was internal, where the memories of things that defied physics and sanity could be kept locked behind a cynical grin in a worn leather jacket. My old analog wristwatch, the face scratched and familiar, felt heavy on my wrist as I stepped inside for my first night, a nervous tick already setting in, my thumb tracing the cold metal. It was 7:30 p.m., the beginning of another long, long night. The lobby was dimly lit, smelling of stale coffee and industrial-strength cleaner. A few members of the night crew were scattered about, slumped in booths, nursing lukewarm sodas. They looked as worn out as I felt. A collection of human debris floating on the currents of the night shift. Small talk, the meaningless kind that fills the void, drifted across the tiled floor for a fleeting, foolish moment. I almost allowed myself to relax. Almost. My gut, a loyal companion through years of unexplainable horrors, twitched. Nothing good ever started with almost normal. Then Jake, one of the team leads, detached himself from a shadowed corner and drifted towards me. He was a lanky kid, all sharp angles and restless energy, with eyes that held a peculiar, unsettling blankness. He handed me a single sheet of paper. "Manager," he said, his voice flat, "you'll want to read this and keep it." My first instinct, born of years of dealing with corporate busywork and petty rules, was to smile thinly and dismiss it. "Rules?" I chuckled, taking the sheet. "Jake, I'm the manager. I make the rules. Or at least I'm supposed to know them all already. Don't tell me this is some hazing ritual for the new guy. I've seen worse." I crinkled the paper in my hand, ready to toss it into the overflowing bin next to the perpetually sticky counter. I was already forming a sarcastic retort in my head about company culture when Jake's voice, now devoid of any youthful energy, cut through the hum of the beverage dispenser. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was a statement, delivered with the chilling calm of a man who knew precisely what he was talking about. I froze, the paper still crumpled, and slowly turned. Jake was standing a few feet away, hands on his hips, his gaze sweeping over me with an unnerving intensity that made the hair on my arms prickle. It wasn't the look of a kid pranking a new boss. It was the appraisal of a seasoned survivor examining fresh meat. "I gave you that list for a reason," he continued, his eyes unwavering. "I recommend you read and follow it, to the letter." Then, as if the conversation had concluded, he turned and ambled casually into the kitchen, disappearing beyond the swinging door. The silence he left behind felt heavier than usual, laced with the metallic tang of something wrong. My hand trembled slightly as I slowly, carefully, uncrumpled the paper. The creases were sharp, like lines etched into old skin. My eyes scanned the words, bold and stark, rules of the night shift. My cynical facade, usually impenetrable, began to crack. This wasn't a joke. This was something else. A cold knot began to form in my stomach, familiar and unwelcome. It reminded me of the chilling instructions etched into the walls of that house in Sycamore Grove, the ones I'd barely glimpsed before the fire, before the memories went up in smoke. It was the same feeling I'd had when Ethan had smiled at me, promising hospitality, and I'd missed the hunger in his eyes, the kind that ate more than just food. I took a deep, shaky breath and read. Rule 1. The lobby closes at 11 p.m. If you should see someone in the lobby past 11 p.m., you are to not say a word to the thing. Just walk to the kitchen, grab a burger, and hand it to the thing and walk away. It will not hurt you and will eventually disappear. If you so happen to break this rule, simply walk away to the office and stay there until the clock hits 12 a.m. My first thought, the thing? Great. Another chatty house. This one comes with a welcoming committee. My fingers tightened on the paper. This wasn't some corporate policy. This was something. It was the same kind of absurd, terrifying logic I'd encountered on those lonely, snow-choked mountain roads, dealing with things that shouldn't exist, things that whispered impossible truths. Rule 2. Between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m., there will be a man who appears at the drive-through window, but you will never hear the beep in your headset go off. Just go to page 2 on your register and tell him he is all set and move him along to the next window. Do not make eye contact. If you should make eye contact, you are to close the window, wait in the office for 1 minute, and return to work. The thing will be gone. No beep? I scoffed internally. Convenient or terrifying? Probably terrifying. My eyes flicked to the drive-through window, a dark rectangle against the blackness outside. I'd seen enough impossible travelers in my time, enough faces that weren't quite right, to know that no eye contact was usually rule number 1 for staying alive. It brought back a shiver of the time Olivia, with her perfect porcelain smile, had invited me into her home, and I'd seen the subtle wrongness in the way her eyes lingered on the details of my face, like a predator assessing a meal. Rule 3. If you send an employee to take out the trash and he or she comes back through a different door than what he or she exited from, pick up one of the knives in the kitchen and stab them. It's not them. If you happen to break this rule, well, we here at Redacted Restaurant Group will no longer be responsible for your safety. This one hit me like a physical blow. Stab them. It's not them. My mind reeled. This wasn't just a threat, it was a command, a horrifying, unambiguous instruction to commit an act of violence. My reluctant conscience, that little flicker of decency I cursed for dragging me into every impossible mess, recoiled. But then, a cold, clinical part of my brain, the survivor's part, took over. Not responsible for your safety. That was the real threat, couched in corporate jargon. It echoed the chilling realization I'd had with Mitch, when the man in the walls had already taken his place, already been inside, lurking in the familiar contours of a friend. The idea that something could wear human skin, wear a familiar face, was a horror I knew all too well. Rule 4. If you get a call between 1 a.m. and 1:30 a.m., answer it and ask who it is. If they reply with Alex, then you are safe and may feel free to answer any of their questions they may have. If it is not, then you must hang up the phone and hide under your desk for 30 seconds and then continue your night. My gaze drifted to the landline phone on the counter, its innocuous plastic shell belying the potential terror it held. Alex. A name. A password. This was less a rule, more a ritual. And rituals, I'd learned, were how the things beyond our understanding exerted their will. Rule 5. At any point during your shift, if you enter the office and come back out to see the restaurant to not be the same as it was when you entered, return to the office, wait 30 seconds, and walk back out. If you break this rule, well, you may never be seen again. The final rule solidified the dread coiling in my gut. Reality distortion, environmental shifts. I'd stumbled into places that defied space and time before, places that had warped and twisted around me, echoing the infinite, hostile geometry I'd glimpsed in that chilling, fake heaven. This place wasn't just old, it was wrong. My hands, usually steady, trembled. This was no joke. This was a blueprint for survival, or rather, a twisted set of instructions for navigating a reality that had already begun to unravel. I folded the paper carefully, slid it into the breast pocket of my leather jacket. My initial amusement, my cynical dismissal, had evaporated, replaced by a cold dread that tasted like old pennies. "Good one, guys," I muttered, my voice thin, a forced chuckle dying in my throat. I know nobody likes the manager, but really? You couldn't come up with something different? It was a pathetic attempt to regain control, to pretend I wasn't shaking, that the rules hadn't just peeled back another layer of the universe's inherent cruelty. A deep, guttural rasp scraped across the silence. "What's so funny?" I snapped my head up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Standing at the counter, hunched slightly, was a man. No, not a man. A thing. He was draped in what looked like a tattered trench coat, and his face was a roadmap of violence. Scars crisscrossed every visible inch of skin, deep gouges and slick, puckered flesh, as if he'd been flayed and crudely stitched back together. His eyes, set deep in bruised hollows, glittered with an ancient, predatory intelligence. And he was watching me, not with curiosity, but with an unnerving stillness, like a python before it strikes. My internal monologue, usually a stream of sarcastic self-preservation, went momentarily blank. My hand instinctively went to my wristwatch. 11:10 p.m. Rule 1. The lobby closes at 11 p.m. If you should see someone in the lobby past 11 p.m., you are to not say a word to the thing. Just walk to the kitchen, grab a burger, and hand it to the thing and walk away. It will not hurt you and will eventually disappear. My mind raced. Was this a test? A brutal, chilling pop quiz on my ability to follow absurd, life or death instructions? Or was it real? After all I'd seen, the real and the unreal had long since blurred into one horrifying mess. The cold sweat trickled down my spine. My reluctant conscience, a nagging voice I often wished would just shut up, screamed at me to run, to bolt from my go bag in the office, to disappear into the night and let the redacted restaurant group handle its own damn demons. But the survivor in me, the part that had learned to play the game, whispered, "Follow the rules. For now." I tore my gaze from the creature's unsettling eyes. It was difficult, like pulling teeth. Every instinct screamed at me to avert my gaze, but also to confirm it was still there. I forced my legs to move, each step heavy, deliberate. My heart was a frantic drum solo against my ribs. The kitchen was a haven of sorts, brightly lit, smelling of stale fries and hot oil. I grabbed a burger from the heat lamp. It felt greasy and insubstantial in my hand, a pathetic offering to whatever ancient hunger sat in my lobby. When I turned, the creature was still there, a silent sentinel of dread. Its eyes, impossibly old, watched my every move. I extended the burger, my hand steady despite the tremor in my soul. It reached out, its fingers long and gnarled, brushing mine for a fraction of a second. The contact was cold, dry, like touching ancient stone. It took the burger, a faint, almost imperceptible nod of its scarred head. Then, without a sound, it turned and shuffled out of sight, disappearing into the dimness of the restaurant lobby. I stood there, burgerless, hands still outstretched, for what felt like an eternity. The hum of the kitchen, the distant traffic on the highway, all of it faded. The air, thick with the residue of its presence, felt impossibly cold. My breath hitched. It was gone, just like the rule said, and it hadn't hurt me. Not physically, anyway, but the imprint of its ancient gaze, the chilling stillness, was now seared onto the inside of my eyelids. Great, Leo. Just great. Another thing to add to the nightmare gallery. The rest of the night settled into a fragile, unnerving normalcy. I kept expecting another test, another impossible encounter. I glanced at my wristwatch repeatedly, more as a nervous tick than to actually track time. 8:30 p.m. came and went, and I kept an anxious eye on the drive-through window, half expecting to see the silent man from Rule 2. Nothing. The lack of a new horror was almost more unsettling than the last, confirming my fatalistic worldview. The quiet moments were just interludes, breath-holding pauses before the next catastrophe. This place was a trap. Every fiber of my being screamed to pack my go bag and vanish. But where? The world outside was just a larger, more thinly veiled version of this restaurant, with different monsters and different, equally impossible rules. 12:55 a.m. The trash bins in the back were overflowing, a testament to the night's modest, yet consistent, business. "Hey, Julia," I called out, sticking my head out of the office. Julia, The other night shift employee, a young woman with a perpetually tired expression, looked up from wiping down the drink station. "Could you take out the trash for me?" She nodded, her shoulders slumping just a fraction more. "Sure, Leo." She gathered a few bins, pushing open the back door that led to the dumpster area. The door swung shut with a dull thud. I went back to the office, the flimsy partition offering little comfort, and sat down at the store computer, trying to reconcile the day's sales figures with the inventory. A pointless exercise, really, just busy work to keep the mind from unraveling. My thoughts drifted to Buster, my mangy, loyal dog. He was probably curled up on a borrowed blanket in the back of my truck, dreaming of chasing squirrels. He was my anchor, the one pure thing in this cursed existence. The thought of him, innocent and vulnerable, was both a comfort and a terrifying vulnerability. If anything happened to him because of my fucked up life, the shrill, insistent ring of the store phone shattered the quiet. My head snapped up. I glanced at my watch, my thumb tracing the cold metal of the crown. 1:05 a.m., Rule 4. If you get a call between 1 a.m. and 1:30 a.m., answer it and ask who it is. If they reply with Alex, then you are safe. If it is not, then you must hang up the phone and hide under your desk for 30 seconds. My hand reached for the receiver, already formulating the standard, "Thank you for calling Redacted Restaurant Group" spiel, when I saw her, Julia. She was walking back into the restaurant, but not through the back door she'd exited from. She was coming in through the front door, the one that led directly into the lobby. Her eyes, still tired, met mine. She offered a small, weary smile. "All done with the trash." "Leo." My blood ran cold. Rule 3. If you send an employee to take out the trash and he or she comes back through a different door than what he or she exited from, pick up one of the knives in the kitchen and stab them. It's not them. The phone continued its piercing shriek, cutting through the sudden, horrifying silence. Rule 4 and Rule 3, crashing into each other like two derailed freight trains. What the hell was I supposed to do? My mind, usually quick to identify exit strategies, was a scrambled mess. Stab Julia? Answer the phone? Hide under the desk? My internal cynical voice was screaming, "This is why you don't get attached. Leo, this is why you stay on the goddamn road." But my reluctant conscience, the one that always got me into trouble, was screaming louder. Julia. She looked normal, tired, human, but the rule. Jake's chilling calm. "It's not them." I lunged from my chair, my movement jerky, panicked. The phone shrieked on, an insistent siren of doom. My eyes fixed on Julia, who was now walking towards the counter, perhaps to tell me something else, perhaps to ask a question. My hand shot out, grabbing a heavy chef's knife from the magnetic strip on the kitchen wall. The cold steel felt impossibly real, impossibly heavy. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate bird trapped in a cage. "It's not her. It's not her. It's not her." I repeated the mantra like a prayer, like a curse. Julia had stopped, her head cocked slightly, a faint frown creasing her brow. "Leo, are you okay?" Her voice, it sounded like Julia. But the rules, they had saved my life before. They were the only constant in this insane, shifting reality. My hand, guided by a primal, desperate instinct for survival, lifted the knife. "I'm sorry," I choked out, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It wasn't an apology to Julia. It was an apology to whatever remained of my humanity. I didn't hesitate. Not really. Not anymore. The blade plunged into her chest. Once, then again, and again. The sound was sickening, a wet, tearing rip, followed by a guttural gasp that was definitely not Julia. Her eyes, which had been confused just moments before, widened in a grotesque parody of shock, then dulled. Her body, unnaturally heavy, crumpled to the floor, leaving a widening dark stain on the clean tiles. My hands were slick with warmth, with something that wasn't quite blood, but felt exactly like it. My breath hitched. The phone. The goddamn phone. Rule 4. My eyes darted to the office. The phone was off the hook, its frantic ring replaced by a low, persistent static that seemed to fill the entire restaurant, vibrating in my teeth, resonating deep within my bones. The blood, a sudden, hot gush, erupted from my ears, pouring down my neck, a metallic torrent. My nose joined in, a sticky stream. Panic, cold and absolute, gripped me. I hadn't finished Rule 4. I hadn't asked who it was. I was screwed. Royally, irrevocably screwed. The static intensified, a deafening roar in my head, 1,000 frantic voices screaming in unison. It clawed at my eardrums, scraping at the fragile walls of my sanity. Then, a sound, heavy, slow, deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. Footsteps, huge, lumbering, getting closer. Each thud vibrated through the floor, through my very bones. My eyes, wide with terror, scanned the restaurant. The sounds were coming from the kitchen. My bloodied hands, still clutching the knife, trembled uncontrollably. The monster, the thing, the one from Rule 1, the one that was supposed to disappear, the one I'd given a burger to. Thump, thump, thump. Closer. I stumbled back, tripping over Julia's thing's lifeless form. The knife clattered uselessly on the floor. My go bag. It was in the office, just a few feet away. My only hope. I scrambled towards it, my legs like lead. The office door. Sanctuary. The door was already swinging open. No, not swinging. Being pushed open, slowly, deliberately, and then I saw it. It filled the doorway. 11 feet of pure, unadulterated nightmare. Its skin was a mottled gray-green, like damp concrete, rippling with corded muscle. Its limbs were disproportionately long, ending in massive, clawed hands. But it was its head that truly broke something inside me. A grotesque parody of a human face, with no nose, only 2 gaping slits. Its mouth, a wide, lipless maw, was a jagged line of enormous, irregularly shaped teeth. And its eyes. They were vast, black abysses that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Twin voids of ancient, boundless hunger. It lowered its head, its black gaze locking onto mine. I was a rabbit caught in the headlights, paralyzed by a terror so profound it stole the air from my lungs. My body, already soaked in sweat and pseudo-blood, felt cold, clammy. I could smell it now, a foul, damp odor, like moldering earth and raw meat. The static in my ears reached a crescendo, a screeching cacophony that ripped through my brain. The monster let out a sound. It wasn't a scream, not exactly. It was a guttural, earth-shattering bellow that vibrated through the very floorboards, rattling the plates in the kitchen, sending tremors through the flimsy office walls. It was a sound of primal rage, of ancient hunger, of something utterly, terrifyingly alien. And it was directed at me. Then, with a speed that defied its massive bulk, it raised a hand, its fist clenching, fingers the size of my forearm. It brought it down, not on me, not directly, on the desk, the cheap, particle board desk, my only flimsy shield. The world exploded in a symphony of splintering wood and a sound like a wet sack of concrete hitting stone. Only the concrete was me. Agony, a white-hot spear, lanced through my spine as the desk above me buckled, its cheap particle board screaming in protest before giving way. My vision blurred, a kaleidoscope of fluorescent light and impossible shadow, as the immense, calloused fist of the creature that was no longer Julia drove the collapsing furniture down onto my already paralyzed body. Air, or what little I had left in my lungs, roared out in a desperate, ragged gasp, tasting of fear and the acrid tang of ozone. Every cell in my body screamed for release, for the sweet oblivion of unconsciousness. But it wouldn't come. Not yet. This, I knew with a chilling certainty that pierced even the pain, was exactly how it ended. Again. And then, blessed blackness. A sudden, complete cessation of pain, of sound, of fear. Nothing. I woke to the insistent, rhythmic tap, tap, tap of fingernails on glass. My head throbbed, a dull, aching drum. My body felt like a sack of broken bones, every muscle screaming in protest. The smell of disinfectant and stale coffee was overwhelming. I was lying on the cold, tiled floor of the office, curled in a fetal position, my back aching where the desk had presumably crushed me. My old leather jacket was twisted around me, a comforting, familiar weight. A man was standing over me, bald, impeccably dressed in a suit that looked far too expensive for this place. He had a strange, almost serene smile on his face, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He offered a hand, not to help me up, but holding something small and rectangular. "Ah," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, utterly devoid of emotion. "I see you've met our nice monster who lives in the woods." "Nice?" I croaked, my throat raw. Every word was a struggle. "That thing tried to kill me." The memory of its black, hungry eyes, its monstrous form, was already burning itself into the permanent gallery of horrors in my mind. Right alongside the pig creature from that last job, the one that had mirrored my face. The bald man merely inclined his head slightly, a gesture of polite dismissal. He held out the small rectangle. It was an envelope. I fumbled for it, my fingers clumsy. Inside were crisp, new $100 bills, a small fortune. "That," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm, "is for you. A little bonus for doing such a good job on your first night here. We value compliance above all else at Redacted Restaurant Group." I stared at the money, then up at him, my mind struggling to grasp the sheer, bewildering absurdity of it all. A bonus for surviving, for committing murder, for enduring a literal monster. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, to scream, to ask what the hell this was. But he raised a dismissive hand, waving away my impending questions as if they were bothersome gnats. "No need for a response. There's plenty more where that came from. Should you wish to continue your journey with the Redacted Restaurant Group, good day." "Ani," he turned, the faint rustle of expensive fabric the only sound, and walked out of the office and disappearing as silently and abruptly as the lobby creature had, as if nothing had happened, as if the monster, Julia's murder, the blood, the crushing agony, as if none of it had been real. But it was real. Every terrifying, soul-shattering second of it. The lingering metallic tang in my mouth, the phantom pain in my back, the image of that black maw burned into my retinas. My fingers instinctively went to my breast pocket, the crumpled rules, still there. I decided to return. What else was there? Running was just changing the scenery. The horrors always found me. They were drawn to me, a beacon, a magnet. It was a curse I'd lived with since that night in Sycamore Grove, when my own past had turned into ash and smoke, and something unspeakable had left me as the sole survivor. The universe wasn't indifferent. It was actively hostile. A vast, grotesque farm where things like me were cultivated for unknown ends. There was no escape, not even in death. Not if heaven was just another monstrous, soul-sucking trap. I've been back here for a year now. The rules are still the same, though I've learned to anticipate them, to read the subtle shifts in the air, the faint wrongness in the silence. But it's getting worse. Each night is a little more twisted, a little more demanding. I still wear my leather jacket, still check my old wristwatch, still carry the weight of all the other horrors I've survived. The phantom hitchhiker, Ethan, Olivia, Mitch, the pig creature, the NDE. They all weave into the fabric of this ongoing nightmare, each a thread in the tapestry of my accumulated trauma. My go bag is always packed, always ready, and Buster, my loyal, oblivious Buster, waits for me in the truck. He's the only reason I keep coming back, the one pure thing I still have to protect. I think I've even discovered a new rule, one that wasn't on the paper. Something to do with the meat freezer, and what happens if the temperature drops too low for too long. Lord help me. 9 on 99 characters.